So we're going to start in about a minute or so. If you want to get a cup of coffee, go ahead. All right, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you very brave people coming out on really literally one of the worst days we've had in a while, weather days. And I know that you're here because this topic matters so much. And so I'm just delighted that you're here. And know that we have some coffee in the back. In a little bit, we'll have some other kinds of treats to kind of get us going. But maybe the size and the number of us is an advantage because we can really have a conversation. So I'm Jenna Bednar. I am a professor of political science and public policy, split my time between LS&A and political science and the Ford School. I'm also co-chair with Dean Rosie Sabajo of LS&A and Dean Celeste Watkins-Hayes of the Ford School of a presidential initiative, Democracy, Civic Empowerment, and Global Engagement. And this is a year-long campus-wide theme year, focusing and lifting up Michigan expertise in the democracy space. Our efforts are going to continue next year, so stay tuned. And we do have a website, democracy.umich.edu, where you can continue to follow us and see as we develop our projects. So this 2-day spread over 3-day symposium is a major feature of what we've been doing this year. The idea or inspiration, in some senses, democracy's information dilemma speaks for itself. We're at a moment in an era, I suppose, where we have more access to information than we've ever had before. It's this fire hose, and for democracy to work, we need the citizens to be informed, so you might think that this would be the best of times, and yet somehow it is absolutely the worst of times. And so we've decided to organize a close look at this dilemma over 4 different sessions. And with the goal that, and hoping that you are able to attend not just today, but some of those other sessions, I'll walk you through them, but with the goal that in looking at these different facets of this dilemma, we all come away a little bit better informed and also with a sense of what we might do about it. So the structure today's session is focused on just level setting. Where are we in terms of the media environment, the good and the bad, and the promise? I hope we hear a little bit. Then tomorrow morning, well, I should say, then we have a fun interlude, which is if you want to come with me at about 3:30 for a live podcast recording with Kara Swisher, the great tech writer, and Jeff Lawson, who is the owner of The Onion. That'll be a fascinating conversation, and although we had pre-registration, my thoughts are with today's weather, you all are exactly the kind of people, the intrepid souls, who will be able to have access to that room. So come on over to the Ford School at 4 for that. Then tomorrow morning, join us over at the Business School at Ross in the Blau Colloquium, where in the morning we'll think about one of the dangers of information, which is disinformation, and methods for overcoming it, for us getting informed and avoiding it, but also thinking about the ways that the tech community itself is trying to overcome that problem. In the afternoon, we'll think about information platforms, information technologies, and hopefully not all bad news, but some good news as well about how technology can be a friend and enhancer of democracy, including a simulation of a platform that encourages citizen deliberation. Then, very importantly, stay for student poster presentations, about a dozen posters that are fabulous. And we need you to vote for your favorite, because there's a very lovely not cash, but whatever counts as cash these days, monetary prize for the top 3 vote getters. So please do stay and vote for those, and then if you can stay, we'll host dinner for you. And then returning Friday morning to that room, to think about, okay, what have we learned, and how could we think about designing civic education in the higher ed environment, given our concerns. So I am really hoping that you all are able to participate in as much of that as interests you and fits into your schedule. But I think the more that we can talk with one another, the better off our society will be. And so with that in mind, we have an amazing team. Is Ruth in the room? Ruth Odenbach. She's probably the one who checked you in. Seth Schaefer, who's right here, who designed everything visual you're seeing, including, I just love this poster. And Landon Myers, who's our project manager. We as a team really want you to feel comfortable and welcome, and so throughout there will be food and coffee, and tomorrow night there's drinks, because food helps us talk with one another, and that's really the goal. I'm going to turn this over to each one of these sessions has been organized independently, kind of with a common goal, but quite independently by different scholars. And I'm going to turn this over to my friend and colleague, Yana Krupnikov, who is a professor of communication and media studies and has written a number of books. Each one is like more exciting than the last, helping us understand how citizens acquire information, what they do with that information, and how that affects the extent to which our society is fractured, and the extent, therefore, that democracy is threatened in this moment. Her work just couldn't be more relevant for what we're doing. So please welcome Yana up, and Yana will walk us through what's happening for this session.
Well, hello. I am Yana. I'm a professor in communication and media, and I'm also a news optimist. So this is where I'm going to set the stage today. Today we're going to talk about the role of news in democracy. We are so excited to have everyone here, and I guess on the live stream as well, for folks who didn't want to brave the rain. So what are we talking about when we talk about news? We're going to talk about a number of questions in this session, but the first thing I want to point out is the reason that we're talking about the news is because researchers have long suggested that the news is pivotal for democracy, that it is, quote, the lifeblood of a democracy. So where are people getting the news? Well, people are worried about it. At this point, when democracy is important and the news is important to democracy, there are worries about journalism and the ability of the media to essentially serve this informational purpose. Right. The possibility that, as this article suggests, Americans have lost faith in the news is striking and worrisome and important. So today we're going to think about 3 questions. We're going to start with this idea of where are people getting information. Then we're going to talk about whether news audiences are shrinking. I'm not going to spoil the answer for you. And finally, we're actually going to talk about what we can do. How can we get the news to people? Right? How can we connect people and communities to information? So let's start with where are people getting information. Over time, one thing that we see is that increasingly the way that we're connected to information is digital. This is Pew, who have long been covering how people are connected to the news. And we see this kind of incredible rise in access to the news via digital devices way up there. So poor radio and print publications, right? Most people are connecting with the news digitally, which means a wide variety of ways. What is a digital platform? Well, a lot of people are getting the news. What they mean by digital platforms is they're going to the New York Times website. But one thing that I think we all think of in terms of people getting the news digitally is social media. And that is, in fact, has been rising. That's a complicated question. What do people mean when they say they get their news via social media? Well, it turns out they mean a lot of things. We asked some University of Michigan undergraduate students. This is what they said. I'm signed up for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and then I'll just see regular things on social media like Instagram and TikTok, right? So this is somebody who's combining all sorts of information that is out there. These students are not alone. Pew finds that many people are getting information, and especially news headlines, through social media platform. TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. The distinction on where you're getting information, I'm going to say, is largely age-based. So it makes sense that when we asked some undergraduate students, they pointed to TikTok and Instagram rather than Facebook, which my students have told me is in fact for old people. So now you know. But people are also getting news from each other. Getting the news is incredibly social. We think this is what's happening now, but getting the news has always been social. Back in the 1950s and the 40s, when Paul Lazarsfeld decided to ask people how they get information, he found that often people said they got it from their neighbors. It just so happens that now our neighbors are on TikTok rather than near us. Here's another student. I'm probably that person who's checking the news the most, but I have a group chat with some friends, and sometimes we will have some stuff said in there, right? A really social experience of getting the news. Another student. I like to read the news, the Financial Times, and sometimes I'll read the New York Times, and my mom likes to send me a lot of news articles. Again, right? Getting the news from each other. My dad usually sends interesting articles or things he's found interesting from the news of the day. The news is an inherently social experience. And here's one of my favorite responses. My friends often share the news with me. I can say most of the time the news they share is meaningful, but sometimes it got exaggerated in their retelling. For example, my parents always share some ridiculous fake news. Okay. So, the opposite of the mom who sends helpful articles. The news is very social. People are getting the news from each other. As Pew points out, when people are going to these social media platforms, they're certainly getting the news from celebrities or influencers. We'll talk about influencers quite a bit toward the end of the session. They're getting the news from journalists who increasingly feel like they have to be on these platforms. But most of the time, they're getting the news from people they know. They're getting the news from friends and family. We have replicated the old school Lazarsfeld neighborhood scenario. Now we're just doing it over the internet. Now, when we think about where people are getting the news, maybe especially in the wake of the 2024 election, I think a lot of us are increasingly starting to think of alternative news sources. We don't think of the student who finds the New York Times article through their group chat, or we don't think of a person who sees a headline on Facebook. I think oftentimes we're thinking of people who are getting information from alternative sources, people who aren't journalists, people who have monetized their ability to influence but are now just talking about news and politics. We're often thinking about news influencers. And that is, in fact, the case. Pew finds, for example, that 4 in 10 adults who are under 30 are reporting that they're getting their information from news influencers. Who are news influencers? That is an enormous group of people. This includes people who used to work for legacy and mainstream journalism and media outlets, but it includes people who've actually never had a job in journalism. It includes people who are trying to report community news and information. It involves people who have very, very clear political positions. The idea of getting your news from news influencers is something that is incredibly important and incredibly kind of the moment, and it's actually something we are going to revisit at our panel at the end of this session. But another important thing that we often don't think about is that a lot of times people are getting their information actually from places that we, possibly in this room, wouldn't think of the news at all. This is a team of researchers publishing in the journal Political Communication. When they followed people browsing information online and then coded what information they were getting, what they found is that less than 1% of all people's visits were to websites that we would identify as the news. When people did encounter political information, it was often through websites and sources that these researchers wouldn't call the news or wouldn't call political, right? It was encountering politics, for example, through ESPN or places like that. So what does this mean? What does it mean that we have, as Jenna suggested, more information than ever before, and that information is social? What does that mean about getting information to people? It means they're getting it somewhere. We're probably not going to solve exactly where in this session, but we will hopefully think about what it means that we have so much access. The 2 questions then that we're going to consider in a second are these 2. Are news audiences shrinking? And can we actually get people the news? We are going to start with this first question, and we are going to turn to Ben Toff, who is a professor at the University of Minnesota, who I'm going to give a longer introduction for in a second here. And then we hope we will stay for the panel about getting the news to people. That's going to feature Ariel Hazel and Samantha Ragland, who is here from Florida. And who I made walk here from North Quad. Right, so our news audience is shrinking. We are so lucky to have Ben here, who is used to this weather, coming from Minnesota, though he did remind us that in Minnesota they have underground tunnels, which would have made this walk better. Ben is an associate professor at the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication. He's also the director of the Minnesota Journalism Center and is a faculty affiliate at the Center for the Study of Political Psychology and the Department of Political Science at the University of Minnesota. We are so lucky to have him here because he studies news audiences and political engagement, things like public opinion and changing journalistic practices. He is the author of the book, Avoiding the News, Reluctant Audiences for Journalism, which came out in 2024 with Columbia University Press. I would strongly encourage you, not during his talk, but immediately after, we'll have a break, to order this book. It is truly a great read and just incredibly illuminating in terms of what people expect of the news and why they increasingly avoid the news. It helped me understand myself and my relationship with the news. And his research has also been published across a tremendous number of academic outlets. And he's also someone that has spent a lot of time working with news trust and communities in terms of getting people access to local journalism. So I am going to turn it over to Ben for the first part of the session to talk about whether news audiences are shrinking and why that might be the case, especially in the context of so much information. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jana, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for braving the weather to join us today. I'm really thrilled to be here. So as Jana said, I think there's a great introduction for what I'm going to focus on in my presentation. I am going to talk about news avoidance, the subject of the book I wrote with my co-authors, Ruth Palmer at IE University in Madrid, and Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen, who's now at the University of Copenhagen. This is a study that began almost a decade ago. In 2016 is when I first started studying this phenomenon of news avoidance. A lot has changed in the world. A lot of things that we were starting to see back then have just kind of accelerated. And so I'm going to talk about why news avoidance is rising, why it's increasing, how it matters, and a little bit about what maybe to do about it. A lot of times when I've talked about news avoidance, I'm often delivering a version of this talk for journalists who are really desperately trying to understand the public's changing relationship with news and wanting to know what to do about it, how they can reach and engage with those audiences that they know that they're increasingly disconnected from. And so I'll share a little bit about some of the work I've been doing more recently on that subject, working with news organizations in the past couple of years. So the introduction was really a great starting point for what I'm going to talk about, because we do live in a world in which news and information is more abundant and accessible than really ever before. In theory, I think many of us feel like this image is expressing. We just feel like we're just constantly bombarded with information. And yet, there are millions of people around the world who are consistently avoiding the news, or saying, at least in surveys, that they are accessing news less often than once a month or never. Many more who are just infrequent consumers of news. And more broadly, we see these patterns of declining use of news, interest in news, and certainly more and more parts of the public who just simply see news as irrelevant or not worthwhile or value to their time. The Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford, which is where this project began, does an annual survey of news audiences around the world called the Digital News Report. And this project really began there. They normally were screening out a portion of the survey who said that they consume news less often than once a month. They didn't know anything about them. And then they started asking as well this question: do you find yourself actively trying to avoid the news, starting in 2017, which is around the time this project began. And since then, we've seen significant increases in the percentage of people who say that they are actively avoiding the news. In some countries, double the percentage over a short number of years. Brazil and the UK, for example, but also increases in the US. We also see more recently, this is data from the 2024 Digital News Report, they asked about whether you feel worn out by the amount of news these days. And we also see increases there. Of course, some of this corresponds to the COVID-19 pandemic, which happened as we were wrapping up our data collection on this project. Similarly, we see, just in terms of interest in news across many places in the world, declining levels of interest. By double-digit percentage decreases in interest in many places around the world. And so, I think for many of us in this room who are thinking about the American context, a lot of maybe what we're thinking in terms of top of mind has to do with the political environment. But these are patterns we're seeing all over the world. And so there's something more going on than just politics driving this phenomenon. So, as Jana mentioned, we wrote this book, Avoiding the News, and that's really the focus of this project. We wanted to understand why we were seeing these patterns. What does it mean when people are living largely without news? And to what degree is this actually a problem? Because there are many people, I think, who would argue very vehemently that actually the news is the problem, and they're much better off avoiding it, and they are avoiding it for a reason. So thinking through the degree to which this is a problem for news organizations, the degree to which it's a problem for the public itself. It's a big focus of the project. So our starting point was really this question. We know that news is more abundant. It's more accessible, at least in principle, to more and more people. So therefore, avoiding it when people are not consuming it is a meaningful phenomenon, which we wanted to understand what was really going on. It's not simply that people are not using it, that there's something more going on in terms of motivating that behavior. So I'm going to talk about our approach to this project. What do we actually do to try to understand this phenomenon? Who is it that we're talking about when we're talking about news avoiders? Then I'll talk about our findings, which we've kind of tried to structure the parts of the book, and I'll sort of preview the way that the talk is structured around what we call the 4 I's: identities, ideologies, infrastructures, and inequality. And then I'll talk at the end about some of our conclusions, some of our findings, implications for the information environment in general. And as I said, some of the more recent projects we've been doing, trying to understand what will work to try to build engagement with news avoiders. So the project as a whole, I think one of the key questions that we often get when we have presented on this, and as more and more of the public became aware of this phenomenon of news avoidance, is what do we actually mean? How do we define this phenomenon of news avoidance? And there's really, there's been a massive increase in research on the subject. This is, if you go in Google Scholar and you search for studies that use the term news avoidance, just since, around the time that we started researching this phenomenon to a couple years ago, an exponential increase in research on this subject. Clearly, the COVID-19 pandemic had something to do with how much this concept was resonating with people, but also just the changes in the media environment have led, I think, more and more people to be interested in this phenomenon and trying to understand it. One of the challenges in terms of research on the subject is that there are different studies using different definitions of what we even mean by this term. So, and I've already actually kind of referenced 2 different forms in the way I've been talking about it. There is, in the book, we make a distinction between selective news avoidance and consistent news avoidance. That survey statistic I showed you of 4 in 10 people who are actively avoiding the news these days, that's really capturing selective news avoidance. This is people who are saying that they are actively avoiding it. It doesn't necessarily mean that their overall news consumption is little to nothing. I think for many people in this room, you might relate to that that attitude of feeling like you are just so inundated with information that you need to curate your own information environment. You need to actively avoid it some of the time. And it's really closely related to that feeling of information overload and news fatigue. Now, it's a little different from consistent news avoidance, which is really the phenomenon that we started this project studying, which is people who consume news almost no news whatsoever. So the threshold we use is less often than once a month or never, and that's a much smaller percentage of the public. On average, about 3% in the digital news report data. In the US, it's been more like 7 or 8%. So we're still talking about millions of people around the country who are at least expressing in surveys consuming almost no news whatsoever. And this is, we think, the more concerning phenomenon in that there's long-standing research about the, as Jana alluded to, about the importance of news consumption in terms of people's ability to engage in political life, to feel like they are informed enough and to know about what's happening and know how that they can make a difference in political life. But it's not necessarily the same as an identity. A lot of people who, there's a segment of the people who are consuming little to no news who will say they're not actively avoiding it, they're just not consuming it. They either never develop the habit, or they just have no interest in it, and they're not seeking it out, or they're not trying to avoid it. But there are also many people who are in both categories. There's a lot of overlapping aspects of this phenomenon among people who are deliberately avoiding it, who are also not consuming any of it. But it's important to keep those two things separate, because I think that first percentage gets a lot of attention about people who are actively avoiding it, and we sometimes assume that means they're not getting any news at all, but that's actually not the case. There's a lot of people who say that they're actively avoiding it who are still consuming almost as much news as anybody else. So it's important to keep that distinction in mind. Now, our focus, again, was more on the consistent news avoidance, because we think that's the more concerning phenomenon. And what we tried to understand in our project was what people's perspectives were like. We tried to understand what their lives were like on a day-to-day basis, how they thought about the concept of news and journalism and its role and value in their lives, or lack thereof, and what their practices around using news and media actually looked like, to try to understand in as holistic as a way possible what this phenomenon looks like from the perspective of people who say that they consume little to no news. And so in that sense, it's a very inductive bottom-up approach, which is a little different than a lot of social science. We didn't come in with like our hypotheses about what this is and what its implications might be. We really tried to understand, just as a starting point, what does this look like from people's own experiences, in their own words, from their own perspective, why they have made the choices they have, and what structures those experiences. And so we're really shaped quite a bit by some other academic research that has also taken a very similar inductive approach. Kathy Kramer's work, The Politics of Resentment, which looks at the urban-rural divide, is a similar kind of inductive study trying to understand people's relationships with political life in this way, by talking to people in their communities in depth and in qualitative approach. Kathy was also my PhD advisor at the University of Wisconsin, so I work closely with her on this book. Is also a University of Michigan alum. So it's nice to be here presenting this work, given that background. Nina Eliasov's work on avoiding politics. Nina Eliasov's a sociologist. She tried to understand this phenomenon of people who are disengaged from politics, or the degree to which people don't talk about politics in their own communities, and trying to understand why, by talking to people, again, in a very inductive way, to understand what that experience is like from their perspective. And Anne Swidler's work is another sociologist who tried to understand the phenomenon of love in the role of culture in shaping the way that people understand that phenomenon. These were the works that we had in mind as we developed this project, so much more sociological. My background, my training is actually in political science, but we found a lot of value in approaching this without a lot of preconceptions about how people were thinking about news and journalism, but trying to understand from their perspective, in their own experience, what these things are actually looking like. So, as you might imagine, our approach involved a lot of qualitative interviewing. We conducted 163 interviews with people, for the most part, in their homes, in their communities, trying to understand what those experiences were like, why they had the behaviors that they had adopted. We started the project in the UK. I was originally a postdoc at the University of Oxford, where this project began. The time period of this was just after the Brexit vote in the UK, so people were sort of grappling with the implications of all of that. It was a major subject that people were thinking about as they talked about what the news environment looked like. I started working with my colleague Ruth Palmer, who's based in Madrid. She did a series of interviews very similarly in Spain. That was after there was a vote about Catalonian independence, which was really dominating the news cycle there. Then in the US, we did another round of interviews with news avoiders in Iowa, both before and after the Iowa caucuses in 2020, or late 2019. In the US, we also did a round of interviews with what we called news lovers, people at the other extreme who consume news more than 10 times a day, trying to understand, who are based in the same communities as the news avoiders we were interviewing, trying to understand their relationship with news in the same places, the same sources of news, same information environment, but a very different approach to thinking about the value of news in their daily lives. We also had a lot of survey data. So we had the digital news report data. We also conducted our own survey in the US in August 2020. using some of what we were finding in our qualitative interviews to inform the kinds of questions we asked about. And so as I share some of what came out of these interviews, I'll also intersperse that with some of the survey data to give you a sense of how generalizable some of those sentiments are or are not. So the surveys, as I said, help us to understand those correlations, those patterns in a representative way. The interviews, however, are really the focus of the work, and they allow us to let people speak for themselves about their own attitudes, their own perceptions of the value of news and journalism or lack thereof in their daily lives. And so we talk to people, again, trying to capture what their daily routines were like, what their media habits were like, with whom they interacted, discussed important information in their lives, separate from the question of journalism, but just what did they think was important and valuable. The most important problem that they felt like in their own lives or in their own community. And then lastly, we kind of worked up to more specific questions about journalism, news media, technology, and how they thought about the value of those things and what they actually looked like. So it's a very inductive study. We focus on a few different kind of important conceptual theoretical tools that we use to analyze our data, one of which was a term we call folk theories of journalism. These are non-scientific beliefs about what journalism is, does, or should do. These are not like, in some cases, these are things that you may be thinking are very flawed or very misunderstandings about the way journalism works. But these are important concepts that people use to make sense of what news and journalism is in their own daily practices. And so we were trying to understand, what are those folk theories? What are those ideas that people hold about journalism that shape their own behaviors? We also use this concept of media choice narratives. We were trying to listen for how it is that people justify, explain their own behaviors, their own decisions to opt in or opt out of using specific forms of media. And then we also ended up looking at what we call news communities. And this really came out of the interviews. As we did more of these interviews, we found, as sort of previewing, and as Jana was previewing, the importance of people's social communities, their social ties, in structuring how valuable they saw paying attention to news or lack thereof, what kind of social benefits they derive from news consumption or not. And so this idea of news communities became an important lens for understanding people's, understanding the phenomenon of news avoidance. So these three theoretical tools shaped the focus of the study. We were looking at the kind of intertwining of the social structures, the community, the culture that people are a part of, their habits around using news, in relation to the supply of news and information in a given community. And this is also where looking at this across 3 different countries in very different places allows us to sort of triangulate on some of the different factors that are really important here. And so ultimately, there we go. Ultimately, we focus on a mix of different factors as it explains this phenomenon. And I'll just start, before I get to the 4 I's that are really the focus of the study, I'm going to say a little bit about who we're even talking about when we're talking about news avoiders. So news avoiders in general, and I should say this is a description of consistent news avoiders, although because there's so much overlap between that selective news avoider population and consistent news avoiders, this also tends to apply to selective news avoiders as well. They tend to be associated with people who are from less privileged groups. Younger people are much more likely to be consistent news avoiders. Women are somewhat more likely than men to be consistent news avoiders. People from lower socioeconomic classes, people without college degrees, people who are less interested in politics altogether, so even more so than a left-right divide, especially when you look at this across countries, it's a lack of interest, a lack of engagement with politics as a major predictor of news avoidance. But when we ask people, so that's a little bit of background, when we ask people why, in their own words, those media choice narratives to explain why they did not consume more news, we got a mix of responses. Some people who really emphasized it's not me, it's news, and others who really emphasized the reverse of that, saying it's really not about news at all. It's about me and my life and the structural barriers that prevent me from paying attention. So, for news avoiders who emphasize the "it's not me, it's news," they said a lot of things that probably are critiques about news that you'll be familiar with. People talking about how unpleasant it was, how much doom and gloom there is, how much negativity there is. A lot of people explaining, they just felt like it was untrustworthy. They couldn't, why pay attention to this information when it's not reliable. Others who really focus on how difficult to understand, how impenetrable they found news to be. They felt like there's too much jargon, too difficult to piece together the sort of ongoing stories. When one of the examples we use in the book is, if you're not paying attention to news and you try to tune in, it can be like trying to tune into the 5th episode of the 4th season of Game of Thrones and trying to understand like who are these people and what is going on and why are there dragons, and none of it makes any sense. And so you probably are not that interested and you'll tune out. A lot of news is like that, where there are these long complicated storylines with not a lot of context, so it's very difficult to engage with if you haven't been paying close attention. Others who really emphasize representation and the degree to which they felt like the people involved in these stories, the people presenting the news, didn't look like them, didn't seem to have any sense of like what was important to them personally, and so they really focused on the inadequate representation in news media as a factor as to why they felt like they would avoid it. And others just felt, they felt like news itself was filled with, this is a quote from the UK, mindless celebrity reporting about rubbish. And often what they were thinking about in the UK were the tabloid newspapers like The Sun and the Daily Mail. And so arguably, they weren't wrong that that's what a lot of news was. They just were characterizing all news as this way because that's what was sort of most top of mind. Now, on the other side, you had other people who said, it really isn't about news at all. The issue is I work full time, I take care of 3 kids, I have an aging parent who has caretaking needs. At the end of the day, I just do not have any time to focus on news, and it's not something I want to focus on, given how all of these other complaints about news. It's just the last thing I want to do at the end of the day is spend time trying to pay attention to it. And so they really, others emphasized their own personalities. They said they were sort of anxious, they had a lot of anxiety themselves, and so paying attention to news based on that personality just sort of exacerbated those problems. Others, as I said, talked about those life circumstances or these structural barriers that they felt really got in the way. Now, of course, there's this distinction between it's not news, it's me, or it's not me, it's news. It starts to kind of break down when you probe people and talk to them in a little more depth. It's not just that it's a complicated, when you talk to news lovers, for example, many of them had really stressful, complicated lives as well, but they went out of their way to make time for it. They felt like it was a valuable use of their time. So there's a little bit more going on here. It's not just how much people feel like they can navigate their own life. It's how they perceive the value of news or the relevance of news given all of those things. So these two things are actually pretty intertwined. It's just what led us to the sort of broader framework that we use in the book to understand this phenomenon. The focus on identity, ideologies, and infrastructures that are structuring this inequality in terms of who's accessing news. And so we focus instead, more broadly in much of the book, on those other pieces of the puzzle, the who we are, the what we believe about our place in the world, and the tools that we rely on to find, access, and navigate content. These are the 3 pieces that we really focus on. These mix of intertwined factors that combine to act as a filter through which people evaluate what is worthwhile, why should they engage, or how they assess the value of news in their everyday life. So I'll go through each of these, and I'll give you a little bit more of a sense of what we meant by, or what we mean by identities, ideologies, and infrastructures. And I'll start with identities. And by identities, what we're really talking about is who we are, which is social identities. because our identities are defined really in relation to how we think about other groups in society and our own identity in relation to other people. News is ultimately embedded in social relations. We often think about these days, especially of many of us, we consume news on our phones. We're sort of tuning out the world. It's a very solitary activity. But no, as Jana was saying, news is and always has been a very social activity. It's a topic of conversation, a point of connection we have with other people. It's a shared practice that we when we consume news, we use that to make sense of the world together. It's not just something you do by yourself. And so those communities, those news communities, whether they're professional, social, or family connections, that mother or father who's sending you those articles, that is exerting a strong pressure on people to be informed and to stay informed, that tells people both, communicating the notion that news is for somebody like yourself, but also the expectation that you should be following the news, as well as the social benefits of following the news. And for many of the news avoiders we interviewed, they didn't really have much of a community like that. They weren't reinforcing both the value of that social practice or the social norms around it, or any of the social benefits around consuming news. All they saw were all the negative things around news, that none of the positives that they were getting. And if anything, it was a sense of this is going to create a lot of conflict, and so it's better to be tuning it out. We saw this both in terms of the importance of those childhood connections to news, so the early socialization about consuming news. And among a lot of the news avoiders, it's not that they never had anybody in their lives who ever used news. It's just that often the way that they remembered it was often a father. There was a gendered component to this, but often, it was a thing that a parent did on their own. It was a solitary activity. So there would be, their father or their grandfather who would read the newspaper, watch the evening news, didn't really talk about it, didn't really engage with other people about it. It was a thing they did by themselves. So there wasn't a lot of discussion of news. So Iris in Spain, there's an example from an interview that my colleague did in Madrid. My father would be sitting on the sofa. We had to be really quiet because he was watching the news. My mother, I remember the poor thing, washing the dishes. Joanna in the US, I knew my grandparents always got the paper, but I was like, oh well, Grandpa's a lawyer, so he can get the paper. I don't know if that subconsciously was telling me that only rich people can get the news. So you see, not only are people's ideas about the value of news shaped by these relationships with these important figures in their lives, but it's also very intertwined with those social identities, those ideas of class and gender that are shaping who people perceive news as being for. And often, as I was saying, news avoiders were not part of news communities that would continually socialize the behavior around consuming news. So Brenna in the UK, like I say, none of my friends kind of keep up with news. So it's not like I'd improve my relationships, my friendships with them, knowing more about the news. It isn't something they follow either. And for my work, I don't do anything where I need to know. I work with builders and, road diggers and stuff. So I don't really need to know about current affairs with them either. In our survey, we asked people their agreement or disagreement with the statement, my friends expect me to know what's going on in the news. And we divided the respondents according to how much news they were consuming. So the middle line there is a typical news consumer, sort of average level of news consumption. News lovers at the top, those people consuming news more than 10 times a day, and then the news avoiders down at the bottom, and you see a very significant difference among the news avoiders in terms of whether they felt like their friends had this expectation of them. We also asked this question, how much, if at all, does it bother you to be left out from conversations about the news? And most people weren't super bothered by it, but you do see this major difference between those news avoiders who said, no, not at all, in part because the communities that they were a part of, there was no expectation to be following the news. They didn't really feel awkward about not knowing what was happening, and it was just sort of expected in their community that you wouldn't necessarily be up on the news. We also asked people about who were the people in the survey. We asked people to name several of the people that they talked to about important matters, important issues that matter to them in their lives. And then we asked them, for each of those people that they named, how interested were they in the news, and how much did they talk about the news? And we saw this very consistent pattern where people who were news lovers were most often surrounded by other people they perceived as being interested in news and talking about news. News avoiders, the least likely to have those discussion partners in their lives. So this reinforced our sense that people's identities really mattered in terms of shaping their relationship with news, and that those news communities were an important piece of that identity picture. The second piece of the puzzle has to do with ideologies. And by ideologies, we're not just talking about left-right political ideology, but more generally about people's sense of where they stand in the world, their sense of power, their sense of influence, their sense of connection to political life. So we're looking at people's beliefs about politics and the way the world is organized as shaping their relationship with news. And I should say, partisanship does play a role here. There's no question that there are higher levels of news avoidance in the US on the right politically. You see this very clearly in the data. And we heard this quite often in our in-depth interviews as well. There's an element of news avoidance on the right in the US that is that it's not me, it's news. That is, the news is biased and untrustworthy, and that's what's driving them to avoid it. However, we also see in many other parts of the world, it's much more common on the left. And so there isn't this consistent pattern around ideology as we normally think of political ideology. But there is much more of this other divide, the title of Jana's book, among people who are disconnected, who disconnected from politics altogether, who are uninterested in politics, that are much more widely represented among the news avoider population. We see this in the digital news report data, when we ask people to place themselves on a left-right ideological spectrum. And then we looked at the percentage of people on the left, on the right, and the center, and then the percentage of people who said they just didn't know where to place themselves politically. What percentage of them were in this consistent news avoider population? It's the don't knows that are very overrepresented among the news avoiders, as well as people in the center. But so you can see on the top there, the U.S., 6% of people who place themselves on the right are in that consistent news avoider population, versus just 2% on the left. But that don't know, about a quarter of them are news avoiders. And you see that, generally speaking, across all places in the data, that don't know category is especially where you find the news avoiders. And so a lot of it is about this disconnection from political life. And of course, it's intertwined. These things it's hard to say what is cause and effect here. The less you're paying attention to news, probably the harder it is to figure out where to place yourself politically, harder it is to feel like the relevance of what's happening politically to your life, because you're not paying attention to the ins and outs of everyday politics. But it's also, they were less likely to identify with any political party. And they often would describe in the interviews, they just felt like politics was distant and disconnected from their lives. When they talked about not liking politics, often what they meant was they just felt like politics was politicians fighting with each other, and they didn't feel like, how does this make any difference to me personally? And so they viewed news very much through the lens of politics. They saw these two things as deeply intertwined. So Brenna, who I had quoted earlier, said, I don't really understand like the different parties and stuff. Or Manuel in Spain, all the parties are the same shit with different names. Or Ryan in the UK, I hate politics. It's probably one of the reasons I don't read the news, to be honest. I don't really know a journalist. In my head, I'm going, journalist, politician, I don't know. So there's this seeing these two worlds is very intertwined, and seeing journalists, rather than I think the way a lot of journalists think of themselves as serving as a watchdog, as a counter to political leaders, a lot of news avoiders saw them as part of the same club, this disconnected club that really didn't have much to do with the things that they cared about. And so in the survey, we asked people, how interested are you in information about what's going on in government and politics? This was one of the biggest gaps we saw in our survey data. The news lovers, overwhelmingly, extremely interested in this. News avoiders, not interested at all. You don't get much of this variation to this extreme in survey data. It's a big fundamental piece of what's going on here. Now, part of it is also going back to the identity and ideologies are very intertwined. Part of it is also that people just felt like they were poorly equipped to engage in political life or make a difference in their political system, what political scientists refer to as low political efficacy. They didn't feel like it mattered at the end of the day whether they could be paying attention to news, because what could they do about what was happening? They saw news as, rather than like a source of being empowered, and we often think about, news is going to make you feel more, you're going to be more informed, you're going to feel like you can actually make a difference. People felt the reverse of that. They felt like when they tried to tune in, it just made them feel like it was a reminder of how little power they had. And instead, it was just this relentless, hopelessly negative sense of the world, which offered no ways to take action or respond. So Andrea in the UK, I think sometimes when you read news, it can make you feel worse in yourself. So I've kind of switched off from wanting to know about all the negative things in the world because there's so much nastiness. There's nothing I can do whatsoever to change anything. So reading news is only going to make me feel like scared, and there's nothing I can do to change that. It's just doom and gloom. So you see, the sense of one's own position in the world as shaping whether people feel like it's worthwhile to pay attention and tune in. We asked in our survey agreement or disagreement with the statement, there's no point in watching the news because it deals with things I can do nothing about. You see those news lovers pretty strongly disagree with the statement like this, because I think it's built into, and I'm assuming many people in this room are probably more on the spectrum of news lovers. You feel like, no, news is central to how I can engage and make a difference and be, take action on the things I care about. News avoiders did not feel that. They felt, if anything, the reverse. What's interesting, though, is there's political scientists make a distinction between internal efficacy and external efficacy. External efficacy being about people's perceptions of how responsive our public officials are. So it's less about your own ability to take action and more about whether the political system is responsive. And so one of the measures for this is public official agreement or disagreement with the statement. Public officials don't care much about what people like me think. And across the board, people feel this. External efficacy is low all over. The distinction here is how much people felt like they personally could do anything. And it's very much intertwined with, again, people's sense of their own socioeconomic class and power. Of course, these beliefs propel a vicious cycle. So the more people avoid news, the harder it is, as I was saying before, for them to feel like they can engage politically. When they do try, it can be really challenging to get up to speed, to feel like you can understand the people or the issues that are at stake. And so the less you're paying attention, the fewer and fewer incentives then for our political leaders, for news organizations to try to engage with you. They find themselves catering more and more to the already deeply involved, to use the term from Jana's book, in political life rather than the rest of the public who are already tuned out. Because, of course, they're the most difficult for a news organization to reach. If you're a politician, they're the least likely to vote. So the incentives are less and less there to actually try to engage with this set of the public. So lastly, the third piece of the puzzle is what we call infrastructures, the tools we use to access and engage with information. Now, this is the part that is really different about people's relationship with news compared to the past. If you think about some of the patterns I'm describing about identities and ideologies, they've been present for a long time in terms of people's relationship with news. There's always been people who are much more engaged in consuming news and people who are much less. What's different is today the tools, the pathways that people actually use to access news are also very different than in the past. And that's also shaping the intertwining of some of these phenomena. So by infrastructures, what we're talking about are we're using this term very broadly, not just the digital platforms that people use, although that's a big part of it. So the search engines, the social media applications, the digital tools that people are using, but also other offline pathways, the word of mouth, the neighbors, the other ways that people communicate with people in their lives, those other sources of intermediaries for information. And we focus specifically on people's ideas about how that works, their folk theories about information discovery that are shaped by those infrastructures. And guide people's relationship with news. So I'll give you 3 examples. We wrote about them in this article in the Journal of Communication. This is one of the first pieces that really jumped out to us when we first started doing these interviews, was how much the digital environment was shaping people's sense of their own relationship with news and the value of consuming news. And so we focused on 3 folk theories, the first of which is this idea that news finds me. As Cameron put it in the UK, news should come looking for me, I shouldn't go looking for it. And I think if you talk to anybody under 30, they will often express some similar sentiment to this, where they feel like there's a lot about our digital platforms that just make it more efficient to keep up with what's happening. So you don't need to have a regular habit around consuming news in a sort of traditional sense. If anything, it seems very old-fashioned to read a newspaper or watch the evening news, because these tools enable you to sort of have news come find you, whether you're looking for it or not. Whether this is true is a different question, but people have this perception that the environment allows for that. The second piece of it was this idea that the information is out there. As Gracie put it, the internet is so incredibly vast, there must be information on there somewhere. So if news didn't happen to find you on its own in the digital spaces where you spend your time, all you needed to do was Google it, that it would just be waiting for you, and you could sift through and find the relevant information that way. And so it's all sort of waiting for you. There's not a lot of thought put into like how that information got there in the first place, the role of journalism in uncovering information, in reporting it, and confirming information. It's just there. And when you Google it, you see 5 different versions of the story, and that's the smart way to go about consuming news, given the environment we live in. Now, the third piece of this infrastructure's folk theories has to do with this sentiment: I don't know what to believe. And this is where you saw some real differences, because I think a lot of us who consume a lot of news, those first 2 pieces actually probably seem kind of relatable. It is no question that the information environment that we live in, there is vastly more access to stuff online. These search engine tools, there is access to more information out there. There's no question that if you are on certain social media platforms, you will just find out information. It is much more efficient if your network involves a lot of other people posting that kind of information. But for a lot of people who don't necessarily have that news community, they're not really experiencing it. They may have the perception of news being so easily finding them, but they are not actually encountering a lot of that news. And when you do try to make sense of it, because you don't have a regular relationship with any individual source, it is very hard to make sense of what is actually trustworthy and what's not. And so people would talk about, like Jane, for example, describe the digital media environment as a black hole of information, and basically threw up her hands and said, I don't try to make sense of what's going on. I know knowledge is power, and she just trailed off. And I think for a lot of news avoiders, not all of them, many of them felt pretty confident in their ability to navigate this environment. They didn't feel like it was particularly relevant for all the reasons I was talking about before, but they weren't as worried about their ability to make sense of it. But there were others who really did feel like, I just don't even know where to begin. And it was too daunting, too challenging, too taxing, and they weren't getting a benefit from it. And so they said, I'm just going to check out, focus on the things that matter to me in my things that are closer to home, and go about my life. We asked in the survey agreement or disagreement with this statement: I feel disconnected from the world when I don't follow the news. And those of us who do consume a lot of news, I think often we agree strongly with the statement. We feel like news helps us feel like we can make sense of what's happening. But if you are not consuming much news, it is not that experience. It is the opposite. You don't feel disconnected from the world when you're not following the news. You feel more connected to the world, because you feel more connected to your own community, the things that matter to you. All of that other stuff just feels like a distraction, and a confusing distraction. this was really different than when we talked to the news lovers. And I didn't talk a lot about the news lover perspective on this, but this was one of the areas where there was a real contrast. And we think part of what's going on with the news lovers is two things: habit and trust. They had developed habits around consuming news that made it easier to actually make sense of. It didn't feel like a chore because they actually appreciated the kind of ritual of consuming news this way. That made it a more pleasurable experience, was embedded in their social connections and those news communities they were part of, and so they actually found a lot of benefit from the habitual side of it. They also felt like they could trust a source, so they didn't feel like they had to look through 15 different versions of every story to know what was trustworthy or not. They sort of felt like they were outsourcing a lot of that labor to journalists that they trusted to piece together what was reliable and what was not for them. And so they actually enjoyed it in a way that news avoiders often could not conceive of how somebody would have that kind of reaction to news. And a lot of it came down to the fact that news avoiders didn't have either of those things. They had no habitual engagement with news, let alone news media. And they had low trust or active distrust of the sources that they were seeing. All right, I'll wrap up here and talk about some of our conclusions and recommendations. So, there's a lot of things going on here. A lot of what we point to in the book are these larger forces that are shaping people's relationship with news, which makes it really challenging when I talk to journalists about, what do I do about this? Because big takeaway here is that it's not just about the content. It's not, you can't just tweak, add this info box or start doing your storytelling in a different way. It is a much more complicated and challenging proposition to try to change some of these patterns. Because it is fundamentally about who people are, how they perceive their place in the world, and how they're using media, which a lot of journalists and news organizations they can't control whether people are using Facebook or Instagram or TikTok as their primary way of consuming information. So it's not just about changing the products and news. That's not going to stop consistent news avoidance. One of the other pieces of this is this question that I started with is it actually a problem? Because when you really talk to news avoiders and understand their perspective, a lot of what they say is pretty sympathetic. They actually seem pretty reasonable about why they're consuming so little news. And many of them don't necessarily see it as a problem. As I said at the beginning, many of them actually see news as the problem, not their avoidance as a problem in their own lives. They don't see news as worthwhile. They don't think it's serving people like themselves. They don't even necessarily think it's a net good for society. They think it's actually a corrosive aspect on society. But we do, and we try to make very clear that, I am a professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. I was a journalist. I do feel very strongly that there are things that news as an institution and journalism as an institution does for societies that no other institution can do in terms of uncovering information that we need for democracy, and confirming what is true and what's not. So we do think that this phenomenon is a problem for journalism as well as for the public at large. We also think, as much as there were people who emphasized how much they were perfectly fine and they felt better about their lives not consuming news, there were also quite a few who felt like, it's very hard for me as a person to engage, to vote, to participate in political life because of this. They had their reasons for not consuming it, but I interviewed a woman in Iowa who had tried to go to an Iowa caucus to vote in the caucuses, showed up not realizing what kind of time commitment was involved, didn't realize she needed to have childcare because it was going to be all evening, and went home. Not following the news has real implications for people's ability to participate in politics, whether or not they necessarily feel it is a problem or not. And so I think, this is my normative view, is that it is a problem. And so we do think focusing on responses is an important piece of this. And so there are two options that are possibility. One is news organizations can just give up on news avoiders, focus instead on producing news for people who are already engaged, or they can try to find ways to engage with this population. And that means meeting them where they are in terms of their identities, their ideologies, and those infrastructures, the ways in which they're actually accessing information today. To be clear, the first option is largely what's happening. It sounds harsh, but that is what most news organizations are doing, because it's existential for many of them. They are struggling to survive, and that population of consistent news avoiders are the least likely to pay for news, the least likely to be actually tuning in. They're the hardest to reach. And so many have actually made this calculation that it is more worthwhile for their own organizations to focus on just doubling down on the people who are already deeply engaged, trying to convert those people into paying subscribers or members. But that's obviously a concern. So we do focus in the book about what we think may be done as there's sort of more suggestions. None of this research sort of lends itself to sort of obvious, if you do these, 3 things, you're going to unlock the secret to engaging with news avoiders. But we do think it involves each of these pieces. So focusing on the infrastructures, focusing on reaching people where they are in terms of where they're spending their time, whether that's Instagram, TikTok, X, Blue Sky, et cetera, understanding what those pathways are for information and trying to build a relationship with them there. Second piece of that is focusing on building up products that build up and sustain a sense of community, a sense of connection, the social practices around news use, whether that's through events or whether it's through not just distributing content at people, but trying to engage with them in the sort of giving them social benefits around news consumption so that they don't just see it as a negative chore. And it also involves those identities and ideologies. So really taking seriously the emotions that people are bringing to the table when it comes to how they're thinking about the value of news, how negative it is, how unpleasant it is, how difficult it can be for people to understand, and really starting there rather than just trying to create the same forms of news that have been dominant for so long, but trying to create repackaged content to reach people where their starting point may be very different. And as part of that is making clear the connection between news and people's everyday lives. Whereas currently, particularly political coverage, it's sort of implicit that you already know why these people are doing what they're doing or what matters, what the stakes are. But if you don't have if you don't know where you stand politically, you don't know which party speaks to the things you care about, what does it matter what the Democrats or Republicans are fighting about? It is very hard to navigate that. And so your starting place being in terms of who you're trying to reach is a different framework in terms of the kind of context and background you'd want to provide in a story. Often that isn't being provided. Making news more actionable, so there's a lot of solutions journalism movement has really tried to put an emphasis on giving people a sense of constructive next steps they can take or that other people are taking already to try to address some of these problems in the world. Now some of this is, as I was saying, there are people doing really fantastic, innovative journalism along the lines of exactly what I'm describing, but that's not enough. Because part of the challenge, we would be talking to news avoiders who would say, I wish there was a source that was doing this, or I wish there was a place I could get just the facts about what's happening. A big part of the challenge here is people do not know what those options are. They don't know where to find it. They don't know how valuable it could be for them. They are busy with their lives and they're not going out looking for it. And there's not enough attention paid on the news organization side to figuring out how do we reach people so they're aware of these products that are available for them. And so raising awareness about the innovations that are going on, as well as the value of independent reporting, the fundamental journalism that is the thing that I think a lot of people don't realize is still going on. In the midst of our contemporary digital environment, people see that content interspersed with everything else. And it's not always clear the lengths of the reporting and the news gathering and the confirming information that went into that coverage and how it's different from just the other stuff that they're seeing in their social media feeds. And so I think at an industry level, and journalists don't do a great job of telling the story about the value of journalism. It's sort of thought that the work will speak for itself. But it doesn't, especially when the information environment has so many other people filling that gap and telling you actually the opposite of that, telling you why you should not be trusting all the things that journalists are doing. So we've been doing in the last year or so, I've been trying to work with some news organizations to try to understand what may or may not work, things that we think have some promise, some of which I alluded to already. And so I'll just talk about a couple of these things we think do have promise. So one of them is, I think, events. And a lot of news organizations are thinking through how do we engage with people in their communities, bringing the journalists that feel like distant and disconnected from your community, meeting them in person, getting a chance to actually ask questions, engage on things that they care about. A lot of news organizations have been doing events. Texas Tribune has been doing events for a while. Partnered with them to try and understand some of the events that they're doing as they've moved beyond their big marquee event, the TribFest, which is a way that is a very large event, brings in a lot of revenue for the organization. They're trying to do a lot of smaller events in different communities around the state, trying to meet people where they are in their own community. But they're still trying to understand what role events can play in terms of who reaches them, because ultimately the people who show up to those events are often people who are already highly engaged with news. So is this a viable strategy for engaging with other people? So we surveyed people who attended past events to try to understand what that experience is like, and one of the things we found is, a lot of those people, about a third of them, actually attended events with other people. So there is a social component to going to events that I think is an opportunity there to build in some of those social benefits, that news community. But again, they're mostly reaching people who are already highly interested in politics, which are least likely to be news avoiders. And so thinking through the types of events, the types of focus of the content that you're emphasizing in the events, I think is an opportunity there. A second strategy that we think shows promise is trying to create content to reach younger audiences on the platforms where they're spending the bulk of their time, TikTok and Instagram. And I think a lot of newsrooms are wanting to create that content, are nervous about what that looks like and how they maintain their own brand identity in these spaces. But I think it's essential to be developing that relationship with people who otherwise that's the way that they're consuming information. And so I've been working with both the Texas Tribune but also Minnesota Public Radio to understand how audiences are thinking about that content. And we also did an experiment where we recruited a sample of Minnesotans who did not follow NPR News on Instagram, but regularly use Instagram, and randomly assigned half of them to follow NPR. And we found that when we did this experiment, that people who followed NPR over the course of the election were significantly more likely to trust them at the end of the study compared to the control group. And so part of that was a decrease in people's sense of whether they were familiar enough with the organization to feel like they could trust it. But I think we underestimate how much familiarity is core to whether people feel like they can trust it or not. So that's been a second area that we think shows promise. And the third area is using text messaging. A number of news organizations are experimenting with trying to have more of a two-way conversation using text messages to not just distribute content, but to answer questions, to engage with audiences in a different way. The Texas Tribune has done an experiment that we did that I partnered with them on some research around over the election, where we found some significant increases in trust by recruiting people to participate in this kind of texting experiment where they could ask questions of the newsroom and get answers from them directly. Chicago Sun-Times is also doing an experiment with a technology platform called Midan that will allow them to use WhatsApp to engage with the migrant community in Chicago, who have a lot of questions right now about what's happening with the constantly changing laws, the immigration raids. The news organization really wants to be serving that community. They know to meet that community's needs, they got to be on WhatsApp, because that's where a lot of these communities communicate with each other. How you do that as a newsroom that already has, strapped for resources, already has challenge enough doing the reporting, that this is the question. And so part of what we're studying is, how do you implement this at scale? How do you actually, if there is possibility of building engagement through these kinds of tools, these technology companies are trying to solve that problem to make it less resource intensive to do this kind of engagement work. Broader takeaways, and then I'll wrap things up. I think there's all these implications for news organizations, but there's also, I think, we hope, implications for people who study the information environment. There are aspects of this project that are largely around trying to unfamiliarize the familiar. Those of us who, we started this project, we We work in journalism departments. We are immersed in journalism. We value journalism. Taking a step back and understanding other people's perspectives is really essential. And it also changes the way we think about our own habits and behaviors. These tools that I talked about before, folk theories, media choice narratives, news communities, we think these are conceptual tools that are helpful for thinking about media more broadly. Whether you're studying news avoiders or whether you're studying people who are zealously reading a ton of news content. And it's really made us think about the value of news and a lot of our own assumptions about the value of paying attention to news. I think many of us walk around with this belief that paying attention to news makes you a good citizen. It's a strong normative view among journalists, at journalism schools, in political science departments. I think many of us feel this. Many of us probably hear, because you feel this very strongly, that it's an important piece of this. And I don't think it's necessarily wrong, but it's worth thinking about why we think this. Many of us think it helps us better understand our world, helps us be better, more informed citizens, and we tell people, almost like a religious belief, this is why we follow the news. And we are constantly surrounded by other people who share these beliefs, who reinforce and validate those beliefs. And I think studying this population makes you think about what's maybe driving some of those assumptions. I think those of us who have that experience, a lot of it is this quote from Bourdieu, news provides some of us with this feeling of full membership in the universe of legitimate politics and culture. If we're really honest about why we have our own habits around news, how much of it is really about the other social benefits we get? We're expected to be paying attention to it. We're going to be in a faculty meeting with somebody else who's going to ask us, did you see that story? Did you see the latest thing that happened? How much of it is the social, the cultural value, the sense of this is what I'm expected as a person like this to be doing? Our routines, our communities reassure us that we matter, that people like us matter, that we can take meaningful action to address problems in the world. News lovers value news because they feel valued by it, but news avoiders, very often, it's not just that they don't see news as relevant, of little use, but they think that news is fundamentally not interested in people like them. And I'll just close with this quote from David, who summed this up very clearly. He did not think about news consumption as being core to being a good citizen. He said, being a good citizen, consuming media, those two things are completely unrelated in my mind. I think you can be a better citizen if you stop parroting sound bites that you hear on the news, start caring for the people you're living next to. I would much rather help my neighbor pull weeds in his lawn than spend an hour watching C-SPAN. It's hard to argue with that. I think this is the thing that we felt that really surprised us about the studies, how much it made us reflect on our own news habits and our own news consumption and why we really did why we had the relationship with news that we do. So I will leave things there on that note and turn things over to my colleagues.
We have time for questions.
Yes, we have time for questions. Yes, question.
So I'm really glad you got at the end to this question regarding social media narrative, because that's what I was thinking. Around it feels like you walked right up to the edge and then didn't follow your thinking to its logical conclusion. That maybe it is okay if there's 10% of the population. Maybe it would even be okay if it was more who didn't. And then it's something like we want to feel good about ourselves. And in order for us to feel good about ourselves, we need them to say that they're going to behave like we do. And why?
Yeah, I think that is. So the one caveat I would say, I do think there's some truth to that the concern about it may be to some degree overblown, that people may have good reasons for it. I think there are also reasons to still want to engage with communities that are disconnected for their own ability to engage in political life. But the other piece of it is, it is about 9-10%, something like that, is in this category, at least according to survey data. We also think very strongly that this is really just the tip of the iceberg, that a lot of what we're hearing from this population is much more widely shared among the public at large, that we kid ourselves if we think this is just that percentage. That most people actually are more like the news avoiders that we spent a lot of time trying to get to know than those news lovers that many of us spend most of our time interacting with. And I think that's the danger, that I think you can lull yourself in a sense. And I've talked to news organizations that say, I don't know, there's all this focus on news avoidance, but we get tons of traffic on our stories, all the political coverage and the negative stuff. People say they don't want it, but why do they keep clicking on these articles? And the danger there is you mistake the level of vehement interest among a smaller and smaller segment of the public to reassure yourself that you can ignore this phenomenon. And I think you do that at your own peril, because I think the news lovers are expressing, or the news avoiders are expressing sentiments that are much, much more widely shared among the public, even though our focus was on that sort of most distilled form of it.
We now have a mic. I have two quick questions, not quick. One, you'll see why. One is, this is probably a quick answer, but the correlation between news avoidance or news loving and when you vote, the correlation between your vote and voting for your interests, which I believe is high, but then you made me think that maybe it isn't. But so maybe you could say that, and then the second question moves us in a little bit different direction, because I felt like you were putting a lot of responsibility on media organizations to reach out to the public, and I'm wondering whether there are other segments of society, whether government itself or higher education, can play a role in kind of getting people to become more interested and to become habitual news consumers. Because the way you were describing it, I felt a little bit like we were in this vicious cycle where I don't pay attention to the news because I don't understand it, and then the news doesn't come after me because I'm a news avoider, et cetera. So it's strong correlation, but I didn't see how to get out of it.
Yeah. So on the first question, in terms of the relationship between these patterns and voting, we do get into this in the book that there is a significant difference in terms of not just voting, but political participation in general. News avoiders are much less likely to have voted and much less likely to participate in all forms of political life. And that, I think is reflective of that disconnection from politics in general. In terms of voting for their interests, I think we don't get at that in quite those terms, in part because we really tried to foreground how people thought about what mattered to them, which often wasn't, if you were not particularly heavily invested in political battles, the things that mattered to you were hard to translate into policy debates. There were some who said, I remember interviewing a woman in the UK who said, she said something like, I don't think I have political views. I'm not interested in politics. And then we went on, and she told me all about how she thought about immigrants, and what she meant when I asked her about it. I said, these sound like political opinions, and she was like, oh, I didn't think those were political opinions. I just thought that's what I thought about things, and she thought politics, and I think a lot of people feel this, is about things that politicians do. And that part is they were not interested in it, and they didn't connect the things that they cared about with those debates. And I think that's where it becomes hard to sort of map the things that people care about. I can see, or I think I can see, connections between policy and things that those politicians are doing. But if people themselves don't make those connections, it is hard for them to map those concerns onto vote choices, for example. And so, I think that there's something in there that would suggest something along the lines of what you're describing, but it wasn't our focus in the book to try to map that. except to say, it was very clear that people had a hard time engaging in politics and even knowing where they stood. We had people fill out a survey at the end of every interview where we asked them some basic background information about who they were, and often the ideology question or the political parties question, they would stop and they would say, like, can you explain what these terms mean? I've never understood what this means. And it's indicative of, I think, where a lot of people are coming from. What was the second question again?
Like, whose responsibility is there
Oh, yes.
for higher ed?
I do think, yes. I mean, we framed we know a lot of the audience for our book were journalists and news organizations. And so we do focus heavily on their role. We do talk a little bit in terms of, in the conclusion chapter, about, we do think there's a space for other actors in society, for sure. Whether it's, organizations that are focused on media literacy, and some of those involve universities, some of those involve libraries in terms of helping people navigate and make sense of the media options and the journalism options that do exist in their communities. I think, so there's no question, I do think that matters and is meaningful. And it can't just be all on news organizations to figure out. And some of it also involves news organizations working outside of their own organization. Some of these are more fundamental challenges in terms of, as an industry, how people think about journalism. And we talk about this in the book too, that any other industry that has such negative perceptions of it, whether it's the energy industry or what have you, they invest a lot in trying to change people's perceptions of what they do. And journalists, I mean, I'm biased, obviously. I'm sympathetic to the institution of journalism. They tend not to do that. They tend to want people to just value what they do and just sort of know that the work will speak for itself and you'll appreciate it. There isn't a lot of effort being paid to trying to change those folk theories of journalism that are shaped by culture. They're shaped by movies, they're shaped by politicians. There's a lot of forces that are shaping how people think about what it is that journalists do that are not being addressed.
I just came from the economics department with a talk on news consumption, and their eye was incentives, right? And a lot of the patterns you're explaining could be also explained by, do I have an incentive to listen to news? And one point that comes up a lot in economic circles, if you take a kind of Hayekian view, that people learn the information that's relevant for what they do, that now the information sort of supermarket is so different that news has no value. Let me give a specific anecdote. So a friend of mine owns a company that makes medals for races, and he used to get the news to see, like, what are events, I can sell medals. Now he's on websites that have all the things that are coming up, so he doesn't have to. The news was kind of a general purpose awareness thing, and now people can be targeted. So I'm just wondering if you took a purely economic lens and you compared it to this, not saying that should have primacy or this should have primacy. I see this as a purely kind of sociological and cultural lens. What would we learn from that comparison?
I mean, I think there's a lot there. I think there's a famous study conducted in the 40s by Bernard Berelson called What Missing the Newspaper Means, where he was in New York City during the midst of a newspaper strike. He went around interviewing people about what they missed about their newspaper. And so much of what he pointed to were, in these interviews, was not about the content in people's news consumption. It was the sort of ritual aspect of the reading experience that they missed. It was the social connections that were sort of so central to the way that they consume news. It was the society pages and the entertainment content that they felt like were the main draw. It was really not about the things that I think journalists wish people would appreciate what they're doing. And so many of those other functions have been replaced. If you want to know, what do people care most about in local TV news? It's the weather and sports. And you can get the weather and sports much more efficiently and quickly through your phone. The things that people once valued so much about news have been replaced by the bundle has been disaggregated, and that is a huge challenge for news organizations. Now, I do think there are still people who regularly tune into their evening news broadcasts, and it's because they still derive value from the ritual of it, from their sense of connection. It's serving other social needs and other functions in daily life that I think, unfortunately, it's a smaller and smaller segment of the public, an older, aging out population who still have those habits and rituals. But it's also not often what journalists think is like what they wish people would appreciate about their profession. And there's sort of they put the emphasis maybe on the wrong things. Not that I personally believe the other things are really important in terms of the civic information that's being reported, but that's always been kind of downstream of the things people value most about news. And if you want to get people to maintain their appreciation and connection for the product, I think it has to come from meeting people in terms of what they actually want. And it is more challenging in an environment in which they can get a lot of those things other places. But it's also the case that people, as much as they may spend 6 hours a day on TikTok, many are not super happy about that fact, and they do not feel great about themselves when they do it. And there hasn't been enough effort to try to engage people. They like the form of information being delivered in this way. There's nothing stopping news organizations from meeting those expectations, but providing, more useful information, at least the way they think about it. So I do think there's opportunity there, even given the kind of disaggregation of that bundle.
Thinking about your avoiding the news from a slightly different angle, and that is, I was talking to a friend yesterday, and he has liberal viewpoints on the news, and he has a brother who only listens to Fox News, and he has extremely, right-wing conservative viewpoints. And as I'm hearing him talk, how he can't talk to his brother, and I realize I have friends like that also, that once they're in their silo, once they listen to Fox News or Facebook, they don't want to hear what's other people have to say if it doesn't agree with what they've heard on Fox. So they're being siloed, and the media does that. They feed them extreme examples, as you know, of what they already have heard. And so I'm thinking it's not that the MAGA people are not listening, aren't interested in the news. It's just that they're getting only one source. And getting those people, the big problem is getting people to listen to a variety of sources, especially if they don't agree with their main source. And I think that needs to be addressed, and maybe it will be later in this conference. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a couple pieces in there. One is, I think, certainly for a lot of news avoiders in the U.S. especially, although in Spain is a pretty polarized environment as well, they would express this concern that actually not only did they not get social benefits from paying attention to news, it was such a source of conflict because of their perceptions of how polarized the environment was. So like if you weren't consuming the right news, or you were you were going to say the wrong thing, for those social relationships, it was some people would say explicitly, like, I do not want to pay attention to news because it gets me out of really conflictual conversations with people in my life who do actually care a lot about politics and have very strong views about, like, this is the right source and that's the wrong source. And so it was a way to step out of that. And so I think for many news avoiders, that's sort of the context in which they're approaching this. Is it's actually easier to just to opt out, to not engage in trying to make sense to be able to avoid those sorts of conflicts. Part of that is how nationalized our news consumption has become. That's about the nationalization of American politics. There used to be much more. There still is lots of local coverage, but people's perceptions of news often is cable news in this country. This is something that really varied by country, like what people sort of, I told you before about in the UK, a lot of what people were thinking about news was the tabloid newspapers. In this country, it was often cable news. And so people are thinking about news, thinking about what they're opting out of in the context of that national political debate. But the other part is, like, it is hard to, most people do not want to spend that much of their lives paying attention to news. They've never really wanted to spend that much of their lives paying attention to news. Most people have other things important in their lives that they want to pay attention to. They want to get the information that they think is meaningful and valuable and then move on with their lives. And it is a lot to ask people to not only spend the amount of time that I think sometimes some of if the emphasis is only on you should be reading 4 different sources and you should know how to differentiate between these, that's not going to work for most people and the things that they care about in their lives. It is just a lot to ask of people, and I think I think you have to proceed with the understanding that like it's not a reasonable expectation. Now, this is one of the areas where different media environments make this easier for people than others. So in the UK, the BBC is by far the most dominant source, and they don't have as many options. There's still lots of options available, but it actually makes people's lives easier to be able to feel like they don't have to spend as much time because it's so ingrained in people's, particularly if you're not particularly, you don't exactly know where you stand politically, it feels like a minefield to engage in consuming news. And it is hard to know, why one source is on one side and why, your cousin thinks this, and it is just more challenging. A lot of people would say, like, I wish things, even people who are very conservative that I interviewed would often reference like how things were better in the past when you could just turn on Walter Cronkite and he would just tell you what it is. Now, Walter Cronkite is often criticized for his own ideological stance, but there's something about the simplicity of the media environment that I think people do wish we could return to as flawed. And there were a lot of things that we shouldn't romanticize the past. There was a lot of voices that were excluded from news for a very long time, and it was very problematic what that environment looked like, but it was easier for people to parse and make sense of. And there is, I think that given where people's actual needs and preferences are in terms of like what they actually want from news, that made things easier. So there is like it's not so simple in terms of what the way out of this, because I think it is unfortunately that complicated.
So we have time for one more question. Thank you. So my question is about climate change. And I teach environmental journalism, as I mentioned to you a few minutes ago. I see climate anxiety being a really real contributor to news avoidance, and not irrational, right? So, and not something that's going to change in the lifetime of my students, potentially. And so in general, I thought that potentially the emotional impact, mental health impact of the pandemic and climate change is perhaps the biggest obstacle. And you said pay attention to people's emotions, but I'm not sure what to do with that. So especially as it relates to covering climate change. So looking for your advice on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the challenge, is that the truth is a lot of news is really anxiety-inducing. It is very difficult emotionally to grapple with, and that I think does pose a real challenge. The things that I think there's a couple things. One is in the framing of stories. I think there's certainly, relative to just the sort of drumbeat of negative anxiety-inducing coverage, natural disasters, the impacts of climate change. There is, I think, real value to solutions journalism approach to covering, or constructive journalism approach that puts more of an emphasis on things that people are doing to try to mitigate these efforts, things that are show promise in terms of whether it's policy actions or whether it's things individuals can do, where people can feel like there's something at the end of this that they can take action, that they can actually use in their lives. And so it's not only an emphasis on the sort of doom and gloom over and over again, but that there's something they can take away in terms of that's more constructive ultimately. I think the other part of it is, and this applies more generally to how to, I think about in a more productive way engaging with news avoiders who may feel this, is the other parts about how, for many of us who consume a lot of news, it's not that we don't feel the same sense of dread and anxiety and negativity. Like, many of us do feel that, but we keep consuming it in part, I think, because of our communities, our social networks. It's because we don't just experience this by ourselves, but we experience it with the people we care about. We make sense of it together. You work through it together in a way that you derive strength from your community. And so to the degree that social aspect of consuming news can be more foregrounded in the experience, I think is essential, particularly for news avoiders who only feel the negativity but don't feel like they get any of the benefits. I don't know exactly what that looks like. Maybe it's through events, maybe it's through other kinds of forms of engagement. Maybe it's through partnerships with community organizations that are trying to address some of these challenges. But I think it has to, as I was saying in the talk, like, you have to take that starting point seriously, because it isn't just a matter of, and the last thing I'll say is, often news organizations think about like individual stories as the unit of consumption, that like we put out this story got this kind of engagement, and we're going to put another story. And yes, if you look at like engagement with news, the negative stuff gets a lot higher engagement. But people don't experience it in that way. They experience the accumulation of story after story after story. And if you really treat the experience of news consumption in a broader sense, it's also about the whole package. It's not, you can't just be those horribly negative stories. It has to be just as like the experience of consuming news in a newspaper, or experience of consuming news watching the evening news. You get a mix of things. I've used this metaphor before. If you think about, I think news organizations often think about if you're like selling a product in a restaurant, and you're selling, your top selling thing might be the like chili cheese fries. But if you give people only chili cheese fries over and over again, they're going to be sick, and they're not going to come back to your restaurant. But really what you're selling is the experience, the dining experience. It's the whole package. It's the relationship with your experience of consuming the coverage. And I think there's a potential there, if you think about it in that sense, of the whole balance of that experience, and not just only the, I don't know if the chili cheese fries or the climate change journalism, but it's it's not only about the individual stories.
Thank you so much. This was great. This is the first part of today's session, so let's give a big hand. We're going to take about a 10-minute break. I see snacks in the back, which is always awesome. And we're going to come back, and we're going to talk about reaching audiences. So basically, how much information do you actually need, and how do you reach people? We're gonna get going again here. For the first part, we talked about news avoiders. Do people need the news? What does it mean that people aren't getting the news? Now we're going to switch gears a small bit. We're going to talk about reaching people. And in particular, we're going to talk about basically what can be done, how should information be presented, what does it mean to follow Ben's excellent talk, meet people in their communities. And so for this part, we have two fantastic panelists. First, we have Samantha Ragland, who is the Vice President of Journalism Strategy at the American Press Institute. Sam is a journalist, an educator, a digital strategist. And she previously was a member of the faculty at the Poynter Institute for Media Studies. At the American Press Institute, she leads efforts about promoting cultural transformation and business sustainability in media, helping news organizations serve diverse readers and communities generally. Sam's work at API has been foundational and transformational for journalists. We are so lucky to have her, and I personally feel more hopeful about news knowing that Sam is in charge. I'll just say that. Second, we have Ariel Hazel, who is Assistant Professor of Communication and Media here at the University of Michigan. Ariel's work is groundbreaking in its focus on alternative media sources. She looks at the way people interact with influencers. She looks at what it means to get your news and information from influencers. And she's also looked at the spread of information on social media. She is at the forefront of looking at how people interact with these alternative sources. And so we are also extraordinarily lucky to have her. And I'm really looking forward to having this conversation jointly. So, just to start out, I wanted to give you each some time just a chance to talk about what I'll call opening thoughts about the state of the news today. So what is striking to you about where people are getting the information, and what do you think is the challenge for journalists here?
Hello. Thank you. So to me, sort of one of the most pressing issues for both journalism and public news consumers, et cetera, is how difficult digital information environments have made it to find and sort of also cognitively process information. In other words, this is a lot about attention and what kind of information we're willing to attend to. And so as the information environment has expanded over the last 100 years, but also in the last 30 years, we have more freely available information than ever before. It's more easily accessible than ever before, but it is increasingly effortful for individuals to stay informed. And so 100 years ago, Walter Lippmann wrote, more than 100 years ago now, I think, about these issues and discussed how news often comes to people from second, third, and even fourth-hand sources in a way that is really disjointed and confusing, and it is about these issues that are really, really complex and distant from the lives of most people. And those audiences that are getting that information are already too tired and too busy to properly make sense of it all. And so in some ways, the world that we're facing, the problems that we're facing are not actually new at all. It's a really old problem, but we're sort of in an environment where if you thought the news environment was chaotic in 1920, I don't know what he would do with 2025. And so the challenge for journalism, at least from sort of a democratic standpoint, is breaking through the sheer volume of information and all of its sort of cacophonous forms. And so this is difficult on its own, but it's even more challenging sort of where we are in this cultural moment. And I'll highlight these three specific considerations that are making it very challenging. The first is that everyone is just sick of news and politics, right? It's negative, contentious, overwhelming, moralized, relentless, and it feels like we are in perpetual crisis all the time, and that we have been this way for years. And so any normal person should be exhausted by this, and most people are. Second, there's this deep culture of skepticism and distrust of news and political information more broadly. and to some extent, all sort of public serving institutions more broadly. And this skepticism has really become a default, so that distrust of news, distrust of expertise, and distrust of information is frankly seen as like smart and sophisticated, and that it's good common sense just to not believe anything you see, which is, you know, hard to navigate in an environment where there is so much information. And third, as Ben mentioned, the political economy of the media, that newsrooms are losing money and resources, good journalism and investigative reporting are expensive, and journalists are really having to do more with less to reach smaller and smaller audiences. So the question of how you get through to people and how to get them interested and engaged in news when it is increasingly difficult for these messages to break through to the mass public, especially at a time when there are fewer resources for journalists to work with, and the news people actually do see tends to make them feel really terrible about the world, and they don't really trust most of this information anyway. So it's hard for journalists. They're in a really tough position when you aren't a trusted messenger to how do you go about rebuilding that trust and reaching people when people are sort of inclined not to believe you to begin with. But it's really hard for the public too, in the sense that fairly or unfairly, they feel that they're too tired and too skeptical and too sort of disappointed in the press overall to really sort of make that effort to pay attention. And so the good news of all of this is that it's not that people aren't interested in news and politics or aren't engaged in news and politics. They want information. They want to be involved in their communities, minus some of the small percent of like severe news avoiders that Ben talked about. They want to be involved in civic life. And they are ready to be mobilized and engaged given sort of the right conditions and the right circumstances, and what those are for various populations can be wildly different things. And so part of my work is exploring sort of what are the right conditions and right circumstances for each group to sort of get involved and get engaged with politics.
Hello? Ooh, okay, great. I don't usually need a microphone, but this room is a little cavernous, so we'll go with this. Let me think. I think about this question, I want to also bring to the table a conversation on audience engagement versus community engagement. It's one of the things that we are seeing that is most critical to community like embrace of news, right? And so the challenge for news organizations is that if they're not pivoting away from this audience engagement strategy, which is what are the countless amounts of doorsteps that we should be delivering our news to, and how can we do that as often as possible, to the point that we are overdoing it, as if it's all just noodles on the wall and everybody is a top of funnel reader, listener, or watcher, and we're doing the best that we can to give them the noodle that they want that might bring them eventually down the funnel. But what we have found for especially local news organizations and news organizations, smaller startups, nonprofits that have popped up to serve a very specific community or zip code, is that there is a distribution of news, but it's more strategic, so it may only be a newsletter, or it may be a newsletter plus Instagram, because there is a larger opportunity to reach your community with news when you are focused on community engagement strategies. And when we talk about that at API, we talk a lot about getting in front of your byline to be a community member yourself, not just a journalist, and really step in front and get out. You think that people are doing that regularly as they're sourcing stories, and I guess like kind of they are. But if you're only going out into the community to report a story, which means you're only contacting community when you need something from them, then what you're doing is transactional interaction and touch point. What we're talking about with community engagement, deep levels of community engagement, is actually transformational and relational to both parties, the community and the journalist, and then of course in a larger way, the newsroom. And so what we're finding in smaller newsrooms and local newsrooms is that for those organizations who are doing community engagement really, really well, their community engagement work is the source of the news and the information. So what does this mean? It means that newsrooms who are acting as conveners of their community, connectors for their community, they are gathering them in spaces like this. They are holding open office hours at the local coffee shop. They're doing all of these other things that are actually increasing touch point with the journalist, right? And having that kind of contact with the journalist to get information, to share information, to be a part of collective solution making and story sharing, not just storytelling, has become a real critical part of us being able to do this work, and do this work in a way that is pushing us more toward financial sustainability, right? We're increasing the value add to these communities by being in front of our work and not just behind it. Now, granted, that's terrifying to do, right? Like, journalists were at one point, just a handful of years ago, painted as enemy of the people. And so there's a lot of work to be done to lessen the fear, even on the parts of journalists to do this work. But for those who are, they're also reaping the benefit, not just in the community connection, but in the other part of the challenge of being a journalist, which is that the job is mad hazardous, Like, it's dangerous in them streets, And like, you're not just the first responder of a traumatic event, but you're often the last responder, and then you're the 5 years down the road anniversary responder, and that junk hurts. And it impacts you, and it impacts your family, and it impacts the way you cover news and how you can engage in news. And so there's multiple challenges happening, and yet when a journalist is able to prioritize community in the way they are pursuing coverage, it's not just that they're getting more nuanced storytelling, it's not just that they're getting relationships, but they're actually able to rebuild their resilience and ability to do the work. They are more encouraged, they are more compassionate, they are less burned out because of the connection, right? Like, connection has the power to counterbalance adversity. We are facing adversity in our newsrooms. Our communities are facing adversity on a daily basis. And when we can offer a premium on intentional and deliberate connection, even without a story deadline, we all have a greater benefit to that. And so that's one of the things that I'm seeing. A ton of newsrooms are doing this work, and so we can share more about how that works. But community engagement strategy for most of them starts with asset mapping. Asset mapping, of course, going into newsrooms that are typically largely uncovered, and looking at them from a position of strength, as opposed to what typically happens, which is going into these communities when story breaks, and you're covering the story from a breaking news perspective, and then you never go back, you never go to the funeral, those sorts of things, right? Instead, newsrooms are asset mapping from a position of strength, and they're asking the community to fulfill their, to fulfill the source needs from a position of power and excellence and strength, and it changes the way reporters then are able to cover those communities. It also changes a community member's willingness to share their stories and want to be a part of the news-making process. And so it starts there. And then we have newsrooms who are doing canvassing. And while canvassing is meant to increase your touch point with your community as a journalist, of course, news is happening there. And news and information is being conveyed there. It's a cycle of news and information. And we are in this, we're kind of maintaining the legacy by never wanting to repeat a story, which is ridiculous, because I don't know about you, but we're all here, which means we're missing a lot. And for a newsroom to just keep going, right? I remember one of the things that was so stunning in my newsroom at the Palm Beach Post was deciding that we were going to rerun features across the section, and we gave ourselves a timestamp, and we put a new headline and a new lead photo, and people were thrilled to see the story that we published 2 years ago in the paper the next time around, right? Because we missed stuff, right? But community canvassing is really important, and getting people out into the community, not actually wanting a story, but just having contact. Then you have advisory groups that are creating actual feedback loops. What we are finding is that newsrooms who have advisory groups that serve the entire shop are finding that the conversations when poised or, the agenda is set from the perspective of the community member, news and information is being traded in those spaces as well, both for the benefit of the journalist, because they're getting a more nuanced understanding of community, of language, of identity and intersectional identity that informs their reporting, but then also for the community. Most people, as Yana and I were talking about at breakfast this morning, don't even know how news is made, right? And in fact, in some of these advisory groups, they're like, we've been advising for months, haven't seen one story, and then we have to come back and say, well, let's talk about how news actually works. Let's talk about the editorial meeting. Let's talk about news decision making. Let's talk about how long it even takes to report a story. Let's talk about the fact that reporters don't even write their own headlines, right? And so there's a base level of knowledge that also needs to happen. And when you're doing it from this asset framework and this community engagement perspective, you're empowering people to increase their relationship with the news. And what we have found from working with these folks is they say things like, I'll never look at a journalist the same again. I can't wait to go to the next advisory meeting. When is the next round of advisors so that I can invite somebody to take my place? These are the things that we're hearing, which is really, really wonderful for the communities at large, right? And so what is audience engagement getting a newsroom when you're disseminating news and information? And what might community engagement get you that is going to give you a higher level of return? We will continue, I think, to see more of this across newsrooms, but especially newsrooms that are serving really specific, targeted geographies, right? It's a lot easier to do that when you are the neighbor in the community that you're reporting for and you've got really close proximity to those folks.
Contextualizing within this idea, taking kind of your opening remarks and taking where we're left with Ben's talk, right? We have this context. There are some people turning away from the news. We also have this idea that kind of the talk leaves us with, that perhaps this focus on news engagement is something that is coming from our own social context. That's why I believe this is important. And one of the other ideas emerging from the talk is reaching people where they are. And for some people, this might be social media platforms. So let's start briefly with social media platforms. Recently, there's been a lot of attention to a report by Pew basically pointing to the idea that more and more people are getting their news from who Pew calls news influencers, right? Which is people who are online basically covering information. I was going to say reporting, but that's not always the case. This is something that has been especially well covered in the context of the 2024 US election. So let's start with Ariel. In your view, why might people be turning to news influencers? Basically, is there something that they're getting from news influencers that they are missing from other news sources?
Yeah, so I think there definitely is. If you think about, and Ben touched a bit on this in his talk, is one of the reasons why a lot of people are turning away from news, and these are the people who were at one point interested in news, let's say that. Some of it is due to the real and actual failures of journalism in putting sort of corporate interests and profits above the public interest and stories and things that public are interested in. So it's not that journalism has been perfect here, right? There are real reasons why some people have decided to turn away from the news. And so in that sense, you have a lot of people who are news consumers but have a really sort of contentious relationship with the media. They consume it a lot, but they're like so frustrated with the coverage that they want to supplement it with these influencers who have sort of really unique perspectives, in-depth, takes on things and are kind of putting things in context. There are times when it just doesn't neutrality doesn't feel like truth to people, especially for these people who are really, really interested and engaged. These aren't your average consumers. These are people who know a lot about what's going on in the world, and just this sort of kind of sober, objective, neutral reporting feels thin and just not enough for people. You also have sort of the extreme partisans on either end who just sort of feel like mainstream news is biased and they need to go get their other opinions, and they need to sort of have their partisan talking points and sort of to build that identity and things like that. But then you also have this, the people that are kind of most interesting to me, which tends to be sort of the under 35 crowd who were never really news consumers to begin with. And they have this deep distrust and skepticism of news. And what this means is that when they are in social media environments, which they use mostly for news, and in part because it's convenient and it's accessible and that's all they know, they're navigating this environment without any sort of epistemic hierarchy of information credibility. That means if you are somebody who has sort of a news repertoire or a news habit, you can go into these environments. If you see something, you're like, well, I don't know if that's true, but I'm gonna go to NPR or Wall Street Journal or New York Times and double check. But if you're sort of one of these under 35, NPR, Wall Street Journal have the same level of credibility as your Aunt Susan, your roommate, and then some guy named Mr. Puppy Pants, you know? They all have the same level of credibility. And so you're trying to figure out how to decide what to believe, what information to consume. You're smart, you're interested, but you know that you can't really trust anything. And so without this sort of hierarchy of brands that you know you can trust, you sort of go to the people who you have relationships with. And one of the things that influencers are doing, which is really, really unique and sort of very different from what journalism has historically done, although I know a lot of journalists are trying to sort of do this, is that influencers become influential because they really create communities with their followers. They develop these relationships that are parasocial, but they understand their followers like nobody's business. Whether they have 50,000 followers or 5 million, they really know what people are interested in. So they have this strong relationship with people. They talk about topics that are relatable to those people because they know that audience so well. So they might know that, like, oh, my audience is going to be really interested in this. And you know what? Their audience is, because they know their audience very well. They also tend to explain things in terms that people really understand. If you know your audience really well, you can talk about what's happening in the world in language and sort of terms that make sense to people in a way that when people sort of turn on the news, it's like, I don't really understand what's going on. It feels like it's in a different language. I don't know who that person is. Whereas these influencers are really good at sort of contextualizing that information and making it available to people. Some of these influencers are, heavy news influencers. Some of them are, former reporters or have journalistic backgrounds. And the sort of the quality of information that they're giving can vary a lot, right? Some of it's really, really good, and some of it's just at best, like disinformation. Sometimes even paid for by governments that are actively trying to disinform people. But then there's also these other types of, the lifestyle influencers who develop this rapport with people. And so once you kind of know someone well enough that you're taking their skincare recommendations, or maybe even taking sort of crypto or financial advice from somebody, then you're going to be far more likely to be like, you know what, I like them, I have this relationship with them, I believe them on these other topics, and so it's really easy to start believing them about politics. And so in that ways, I think these influencers are filling a lot of gaps for people that just news isn't doing anymore, that news feels sort of too national, too distant, too far away, whereas these influencers are making it really relatable.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think that news influencers are fascinating, and for the journalist who, this term really just popped up and started hitting earlier this year, right? And so for the journalists who are practiced journalists but have left to become independent, they're like, don't call me a news influencer, call me a journalist, because I'm a freaking journalist, right? And you hear this and they've been impassioned by that. And I think that that's important too. But, again, when we're talking about the faces of the people you trust, these digital personalities or online personalities are doing this level of work. And so if you're looking for as close to a one-to-one correlation as you can, you may think of it as the columnist of the local paper, and their avenue to which they were communicating on a regular basis and building an audience, right? And now you're looking at these digital creators, personalities, influencers, trusted messengers, whatever the case might be. They have a built-in audience around very specific subject matter, very similar to a columnist, right, in a paper. But they have chosen a very unique way of communicating, and they don't just communicate about that information, but, if they get stuck at the post office and it's a drag, they're gonna tell you. And so what does that do? Well, it reminds you that these people are also totally human, and they get upset about some of the same things that you get upset about. And I think that being a journalist and this idea of keeping the story over here has also impacted our ability to be influential in our own right. It was one of the things I talked about at the Palm Beach Post all the time. We are our own influencer network if we could just learn to leverage it. But with the increasing workload demands, it becomes very, very hard to do, not to mention it's a whole other level of skill, right? To just be in front of the camera and talk to the camera as if it's a room like this, right? That's a different level of skill across these shops, and it's added to all of the work that everybody else is doing, right? And so how do you make room for that when what feels like influencer style reporting, if we're gonna, maybe call it something, doesn't serve your bottom line based on these news organizations. It's not necessarily driving subscribers to your newsletter, which is your greatest opportunity to turn, a newsletter subscriber into a paying donor or paying subscriber, right? And so what really is the point? What the influencers have found is that it's the trust, right? It's that we are going to build this together. And when you have a question, I'm even gonna answer it. Do you know how many times I had to sit with my journalist because I knew the story we were publishing online was gonna be contentious and that people will have missed information? So they sat with us at the social desk, ready with a Google Doc of links of their reporting, so that when comments came in talking about why are you covering this now, or we have all of this reporting, right? That we can say, hey, thank you so much for this comment. And we're coaching reporters on how to be in the comment section, but for a digital creator, it's just a way they communicate. It comes to them so naturally to both be on camera, sharing information, and being in the comments in a one-to-one connection with their community. And of course, even that access increases trust.
So to pick up on these ideas, right? We have news influencers offering different information. There's more trust. They're offering information differently than journalists. Is there space, do you think, for them to constructively come together in the way that information is delivered to people?
The answer is yes. The answer is the answer is yes. I do believe that they can come together, and I believe there are lots of opportunities for them to do that. One of the things that we have been doing at API since the 2024 election is we launched an influencer collaboration cohort where newsrooms came to the room to say, I want to partner with these folks. I don't know how, teach me. And of course, it's also new. And so we're like, well, we'll just teach you something we're not quite sure about. And so we're going to call it a learning cohort, and we're going to learn together out loud, and it's going to be awesome. And guess what it was? It was awesome. Why was it awesome? Well, for some of the news organizations, they partnered with influencers that were already working with them. So their community essayist, right? And then they just said, okay, thanks for writing the essays. Now let me coach you through how to do this vertical video, right? For other news organizations, it was completely different. It was a new relationship. And so they had to kind of start from the bottom, but there was a lot to learn. And most of the group said, I'm going to keep doing this. And they have sustained their partnerships. It's why we're funding a whole second cohort of 12 newsrooms for two specific reasons. We believe that trusted messengers is the piece of language that resonates most with local news consumers and with the audience or the small group of people that you may say is an influencer. And so when we're able to bring journalists and publishers down a notch and say, I love that you want a mega influencer, that's great. But what you really need is a nano influencer, which is 5,000 followers or less. That's what you need. That's your real bread and butter. At 1,000, 2,000 folks, right? And you're, as I was giving an example at dinner last night, the senior vice president of the local YMCA is a trusted messenger. He's been in the community forever. He's risen the ranks. He hasn't grown an audience. He is the community. Do you see what I'm saying? And so when you're a local news publication and you're trying to make sure that the right information is getting into the right hands so that these families can make the right decisions for their families so they can thrive, you want to partner with a local influencer who would tell you, I don't want to do that because I'm not an influencer. And then you have to figure out new language, right? Trusted messenger is really powerful language. Community liaison and community ambassador, also very powerful language, right? Especially when you're thinking about how can we disseminate this information in the best possible way. And so something else that we're seeing now is newsrooms creating creator ambassador programs. I've got a newsroom in Texas who's actually retrofitting a part of their newsroom to be a creator lab. They're recruiting local trusted messengers, 5,000 followers or fewer, across 3 beats. They're partnering them with the editor of each beat. Food is included, weather is included, and education, I think, are the 3 beats that they're going to pursue, and really invest in the local creator economy to not just engage community, which means they're starting at a greater level of trust with those groups, but they're also increasing their organizational capacity, right? And that there are skills that the influencer or creator has that maybe are not as predominant in our newsroom, but there are also skills in our newsroom that the creator could really benefit from, like feedback on a story or a storyboard, like not having to come up with all of the story ideas on their own. A lot of these folks are solopreneurs. A lot of them have other jobs in addition to this, right? And so there's a lot of opportunity for there to be a real partnership, not just a one-off opportunity to send out a thing because you want more people in their audience to see it.
There's so much interesting things going on this local level, and even sort of journalists themselves. One of the things I'm doing with some work at some colleagues in the School of Information here at University of Michigan is we scraped all of TikTok for the year of 2024 and looked at any video or post that was about news media that's just not discussing sort of the news and what's in the news, but like talking about the press and the media. And one of the things that we found is that overwhelmingly, it was criticism. It was saying you can't trust it. Like 85% of these videos were just like critical of the media, their coverage on all kinds of issues from the election to international affairs to vaccines to everything. Just, all of these videos are just critical of the news. Whereas the other sort of 15% were often like local news reporters doing the like, come with me on a day. In the day in the life of the news, and these were super positive and really engaging, and the comments were really great. People saying, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea that this was what your life was like," and just somebody at KTLA in Los Angeles, like I had to get up at 4:30 this morning, and do my own makeup to be on camera at 6, and they go through their whole day. Oh, now I have to go get across town in 30 minutes to, report on this traffic accident that's happening, and just sort of sharing their day. And those things, you can see like a lot of potential there in sort of putting themselves out there. I mean, it's a lot of work for journalists, and it seems much more sort of doable on this like local level. On the national scale, you sort of run into a lot of contention between these news influencers and journalists. As you said, journalists don't want to be called news influencers at all. It's like a derogatory term, like how dare you? Whereas, and influencers don't want to be journalists, like because journalists are elite. They're like these fancy people up in New York and DC, and they have no connection with me or my life or anyone. So there's this contention that neither of them really want to see one another. But I think there's still sort of a lot of opportunity there, both for the influencers and for journalists to kind of work together on these things. And when you think about sort of the audiences that are more likely to avoid news, that women, minoritized people, young people, et cetera, has been talked about, they're also the same audience, as Ben mentioned, that kind of the news avoids them to some respect. It doesn't really engage with them. It doesn't talk to them on those terms. And so some of the work that my colleague and I have done is we did this sort of three-wave survey before the 2024 election, and we asked a lot about the influencer use and looked at sort of people who are following a lot of these influencers, what happens over the course of election leading up to the election. And one of the things that we see is that their interest in the election and how important they think it is to their lives, the more sort of content, political content they're seeing from influencers increases. Their actual factually accurate information about the election increases. But one thing that doesn't change is it doesn't increase their news use, so it's not actually getting them sort of into like the political economy of the news media. They're not sort of becoming news consumers. And it is actually increasing their anti-media views. So there's something about it that influencers are saying, here's what the media is not doing. So putting this all together, you're sort of seeing that people who are increasingly being engaged in politics and news through these influencers are also sort of developing these like kind of this animus towards institutionalized news, and this is at the sort of large national level. And I will say that we probed these results a little bit, and it's only women that are doing anything. Men haven't changed at all. So in summary, we're seeing influencers sort of bringing this audience that wasn't really there for political content into the political content, which is great. except that it is making them, it seems like it's making them a little bit more hostile towards the national media at large, which is different from all the local type of things. So it's something sort of we're still trying to make sense of and think about what that means if people who are being brought into politics and news are also sort of being brought in to the extent that they think the news media is bad.
Yeah, it makes me wonder too about real partnership, right? Versus an influencer finding the information on their own and then telling their community about it, and then what pieces are missing, what parts of the reporting are missing, why are there pieces that aren't here? And it can, if you don't have the factual information to fill your story, then you are going to fill the story with the information that you have, right? And so it may be able to point towards some of that hostility. In the experiment that we ran, we found that the comment section of the influencer collaborations was overly positive and encouraging. And in fact, the communities of these influencers said, I really love that you partnered with this local news outlet. Can you do more of this? And it was one of the reasons why some of the news organizations were like, we're going to keep going with this. Even if we're not getting the funding, we will find the money in our own budget, right? And so that is positive. But it points toward intentional connection versus accidental, right? And that I have found it on my own, and these are my opinions about the news.
One thing that seems to be emerging here, right, if I'm putting these two ideas together, is this divide between the local and the national, right? Because here we're seeing local influencers being really intentional, as you say, and kind of getting the news and people having a positive response. And in your work, Ariel, you're noting that a lot of the negativity from influencers is through the national media. And so this idea of the difference between local and the national, and this idea of a ton of research on nationalization, the fact that increasingly the media is covering national problems, is something that has come up. In my recollection, for example, of the news avoidance report, and Ben can correct me if I'm wrong, is that where you don't see as much news avoidance is on local news. So people seem to like local news. People seem to be drawn to local news. And so I'm going to start and kind of direct this question to Sam. What do you think it is about local news that has sort of insulated it from the same criticisms that we often see toward national news? So why are people still drawn to local news and local journalists?
Well, for the people who are, they're definitely drawn to it, right? And then there are others, and like our work that we have done over a handful of years in Pittsburgh, it took a lot for people to say there's a national news story and there's a local news story or news narrative, right? And there's a reinvestment in the local news ecosystem there, which is really, really wonderful. But I think that a journalist who can also be a full-time community member is incredibly valuable. And it means that in the same way that I'm rallying at my city commission because y'all are trying to change like the trash pickup in my neighborhood, and I'm the journalist, right? And now all of a sudden I'm rolling with you because I don't want my street being filled with trash cans 3 days a week, right? And so there's a connection there to issues that really hit close to home. And when you can see kind of alongside what that looks like, it increases your trust. But again, it is hard to find journalists in your community, and there are fewer and fewer local journalists in communities than ever before. If you are most likely to connect even local journalism with the legacy TV or print paper, then it's going to be even harder to find those folks. And so, we talk a lot about the ecosystem and how, pop-up newsletters or startup newsletters and startup shops are also a part of this conversation, further connecting people. The local news organizations have kind of always been this grocery store of news opportunity, but these niche community news providers are becoming even more critical, and it increases the opportunity for contact, which can increase the trust of the information and just the work in general.
And so to follow up on this idea, because oftentimes when local news does come up, it comes up in the context of challenges, right? And in your work with the American Press Institute, you have been really working to support a lot of journalists as they face these challenges. So just to set a context here,
I wrote a whole First of all, there are internal challenges and there are external challenges to doing this work that actually a lot of people are not aware of, right? I mean, a lot of folks still have the news building in their community. It is typically very beautiful, right? And so you assume in this big, pretty building downtown that things must be doing well, and they're not. So here we go. Internal challenges to local journalism, or what local journalists are facing. You've got smaller staffs and limited resources all around. You have the unavoidable hazards of the job, which include not just burnout, direct and indirect trauma, but notably in an election year to date, moral injury, which is really, really rough, considering it has typically only been studied in the minds and the bodies of veterans, but it is deeply impactful for local journalists and typically misnamed. They think that they're burned out, but actually they've experienced a moral injury in the news process that needs a different intervention. There's an inability to set boundaries. There's definitely a lack of clarity in the job and in the assignment. There are often interim editors. You're assigned to one and then you're assigned to another and then another. That makes things difficult. The always on culture expectation typically still runs amok in local newsrooms. In addition to them being digital consumers themselves, how do you separate and maintain your own family and your own boundaries when you are expected to be on all the time? When you never know when a source is going to call you back. They all have your cell phone number, those sorts of things. The demands of the news cycle are incredible, and most news organizations do believe that they need to be a 24/7 operation because of all of the other news and noise that's out there. It's absolutely an unreal expectation that most local journalists, local editors who are no longer just editing copy but are responsible for content themselves, and publishers who are no longer responsible for one newsroom but many. It's the internal challenges are really, really bad. And really, really difficult. And then you add external challenges to that, and it's a wonder why folks get into the business. I mean, they have a heart of care. Journalism at its core is a service-based industry. We are in the role to serve our neighbors and to serve our communities. External challenges include lack of trust, lack of care. There is actually no time for a journalist to care when they are doing one story after another, hitting one deadline and then moving on. You know, during the pandemic, and I was doing trauma-informed leadership training all over the world through Pointer, and I would ask the journalist, what is one story from the past year that gave you the most joy? In entire rooms of news leaders from entire shops, entire news organizations, there would be a deafening silence. They could not remember. They can remember the ones that brought them to their knees. They cannot remember the ones that had the potential to refill their resilience. They were moving way too quickly, and there was no opportunity to celebrate, to honor, right? And that's a huge challenge. Competition for attention, a huge challenge. We're not just competing with other news organizations at the local level anymore. I mean, we're competing with the community foundations. We're competing with PIOs. Once upon a time, these PIOs worked with the newsrooms to get the information out, and now even the police department has their own newsroom. The fire department has their own newsroom. They can send out their own information and content, right? Are they journalists? Or maybe they're not journalists, but they're news providers in some way, right? All of that is competition, and then trying to figure out the right doorstep. If you add to that everybody has a different doorstep, and not all of it is going to serve your financial bottom line, then how are you prioritizing your editorial strategy, your revenue strategy, your community engagement and marketing content and strategy? Becomes very, very difficult, and every year there are fewer and fewer bodies in the room.
A question to you, Ariel, talking about national versus local. In your research, is the pushback really to national politics? Kind of, is local news the way to break through?
I mean, that's a pretty tough question, because on the one hand, Local news, we know, sort of serves as a heuristic. If it's local, people are like, well, okay, it's not part of the media or the press, and so maybe I'll pay a little bit more attention to it. But the quality of local news also varies intensely. You have some amazing journalistic organizations doing like incredibly, very, very high quality work that is, in service to the public. You also have a lot of sort of hyper-partisan organizations or big media conglomerates who have bought these local stations and sort of in the hopes that they can capitalize on this preference for local information to get out for either profit or in some cases an ideological perspective. We've seen that a lot of these sort of online news sites that have popped up all around the country that have a hyper-local focus are extremely partisan and basically sort of mouthpieces of different political entities, sort of disguised as news. So on the one hand, it's sort of what is local news varies quite a bit in terms of the quality. But I do think people, on the one hand, the people who are the intense news lovers that are super interested, the deeply involved, they want the national politics. This is fun. This is the hobby and sport. They want to know exactly sort of at what minute Cory Booker, beat the record for the filibuster, and they're talking with all of their friends about it, and there's whole text chains about like, what do you think he did when he had to go to the bathroom? Those types of things, which I got like 6 texts about that last night, and so those people don't necessarily want to know what's happening in the local school board. It's not part of the game that they're paying attention to, and so you have a lot of these people who are interested in news, but not to that extent. And local organizations are sort of having to be like, well, do we cater to this audience of the deeply interested who want the scandalous national stuff? Or do we focus on sort of like the really relevant to the local, to the people who aren't gonna tune in every night, maybe once or twice a week if they're, a devoted follower, but they're not the people sort of consuming 3 hours of local news every day. Like it's not the same sort of, the audience gratifications are quite different. So there's a lot of hope in it, and I think that's where a lot of these partnerships with influencers trusted messenger, yes, I like that term, has a lot of sort of potential for sort of reframing the local news ecosystem in different communities.
Sharing it too, right? And because, whether it's your local United Way or the pastor of the church or whatever the case might be, this idea of trusted messengers really allows you to expand who can share news, especially when they have a strong relationship with fact-based reporting, right?
Picking up on this idea and thinking broadly in terms of what it means to be informed, and sort of going off of the end of Ben's talk as well, a lot of times our arguments about what it means to be informed are coming from places like this and from group chats about Cory Booker, right? Which may not necessarily be a accurate representation of what it takes to be informed. So I want to start with this broader idea of essentially, are we actually asking too much of people? Are we asking things of people that are reflective of our own social context in which we are hyper-informed? How informed do people have to be?
I think about this question a lot because I think what we've seen in a lot of the literature on public opinion and citizen involvement and sort of the relationship between citizens, civic life, and sort of politics more broadly is that people have become far more sophisticated. In fact, I think one of the biggest gripes that sort of very involved people have is that they only get a chance to really participate every 2 years or every 4 years, that there's sort of this desire of like, I don't have an election for another 18 months, but I want to do something. And so I think that in these notions of sort of what it means to be a good citizen and that you have to be very informed on every topic, I think for the people sort of at the one end of the spectrum who are very, very involved, they have really high expectations for themselves. And it can be really stressful to not, know what has happened in the last 3 hours while I've been in here and not looking at the news. And you sort of have this idea that oh, well, we need to know all of this information all the time. And oftentimes, I have a lot of friends who feel this news fatigue and are very overwhelmed about everything that's going on. And oftentimes I say you could consume less news and still be very informed. So on the one end of the spectrum, I feel like a lot of those people could probably consume less, and it would probably be better for them and maybe even better for democracy if they just chilled out a little bit. On the other end, I feel like those expectations, those people who aren't paying attention, oftentimes they have the same sort of expectations. It's like, well, if I don't know everything, why bother even knowing a little bit? And so I think people are really surprised when I tell them that, like, if you spent, if you just listened to like Up First by NPR, the 8-minute podcast 3 times a week, you would probably be very enough informed to actually live your life and be a really great citizen. So like with that, 30 minutes a week while you're driving is probably enough to know what you need to know. And so it's this sort of, I think as people have become more just sort of sophisticated, more educated, they have put more pressure on themselves. And some people are getting really burnt out. And some people are just like, it's not even worth it to start if I can't meet this sort of ideal of what is a good citizen. I'm just going to stop and like step out and not worry about it because I don't have the time, motivation, or ability.
I think that's why we see the rise in newsletters. And I know at one point people were like, email is dead. Email is totally not dead, right? And email is lovely because there are almost like no ads, right, in your newsletters. You will get a digest newsletter, which can inform you in like 2 minutes or less. And then you can get a deep read on Sundays with the top stories from the week. And then guess what? It ends. There's like nothing else. There's no like continuous scroll that increases that anxiety in this unrealistic expectation to be overly informed. I mean, it's bananas, right? And so you've got to wonder for smaller shops. I've seen things like newsletter products and even like Instagram news platforms take sabbaticals or take breaks. They honor Christmas holiday in the way that most people do. They have like a blackout period during the summer, which is totally unheard of in other news organizations, but like to like just not publish, right? But it's even honoring to your community, right? When you say, here's what's left, and we're back at you in a week, and we will do this, which is going to inform you on everything that you missed, and then we will get back to business as usual. It allows people or gives them permission to be less informed is such a bad way of putting it, but that is what it is, right? Yeah, I mean, it's you allow people to be other parts of themselves besides just news consumers. And I think honoring people's humanity in that way is incredible. I think it's radical for the information and attention economies that we're in right now. And I actually think that people would pay for it. I think they would pay for it, yeah.
We can call it like reaching the correct equilibrium of information. Yeah.
News equilibrium, I like. Yeah.
So speaking about reaching the news equilibrium, you just mentioned newsletters as a form of information. So Sam, I wanted to follow up on that. Are there things you have seen in your work, especially creative ways that journalists are using or newsrooms are using or organizations are using to reach people who may be news avoiders for whatever reason or who are kind of overwhelmed by the news?
Well, the community listening is really, really important. It's happening all over the place, and it's awesome. It's not just happening for specific beats or investigations, but I mean, newsrooms are doing really intentional work to go into the community to be spoken with. The difficulty with that, though it is incredibly helpful, is that newsrooms will come, it can feel transactional if you aren't careful, right? And so for the community listeners to not just, for example, be paid for their time, which is something that we recommend and something that we have funded in the past, for them to be able to set their own agenda, which means a community partnership is really important to community listening sessions. But it is one of the things, like for example, Mississippi Free Press didn't just, they were doing community listening sessions. They found how critically important it was to connection across difference, particularly political difference. And so their community listening circles became solutions circles. And so they went from listening workforce housing or education issues to together collectively finding solutions to those issues, right? And so to Ben's point, like, how much doom and gloom can any one person take? And how can we kind of situate the reporting within a space that says we can also be a part of the solution? It's why participatory journalism is a part of the lexicon now. Solutions journalism, solidarity reporting is a part of the lexicon now. Essentially newsrooms and reporters saying, I was on this like soapbox pedestal because I had a press badge, but like I don't need that anymore. What I actually need is to be in community and connection with you as I am reporting the news to the access and opportunities that I have, not just because my editor said it was important, but because you told me that it was important, right? So lots of cool things like that happening. We talked about SMS at breakfast, and so I was like, Ben, how dare you say something about text messages? But we talked about that as both like a one-to-one connection opportunity and a revenue plan, right? Because when you're talking about SMS with a reporter who can feel very much like they have, insider information is not the right way of looking at this, but for reporters who are covering real estate or covering local business, who are filing the FOIAs and getting the information that they need in order to do the right reporting, to say exclusively that you can enter into an SMS chat for this very specific thing, and we're only gonna have 1,000 or 2,000 people or 500 people or whatever the case is come into this chat with our food critic, whoever, right? We find that people are willing to pay for that. In the same way that your Gen Zers and your millennials and certainly your Gen A'ers are going to pay creators for information and news. We've seen that also in our API consumer research, right? Like who these folks are willing to pay for because they know exactly the kind of content and information that they're going to be getting on a regular basis becomes a lot harder in the local news environment. I know that some organizations you can follow reporters, but most you can't. Like just technologically, it's hard to say, I want to follow these 3 reporters. They are my subscription package, right? Which would be so dope to have, because then those are your news influencers, and those are, these are, I mean, and because like I'm a mom and now I got this kid, like I need to follow weather, I need to follow education, and I need to follow Lake Worth Beach because that's where I live, right? And so, and I can follow them, and I can pay my $9.99 a month, right? And so there are really great opportunities to see what's happening in the creator economy and bring some of that into local news infrastructure and local news business modeling with time and resources. Does anybody in this room have resources?
Excuse me. I think there's a lot of opportunities here, and I think one of the things that how journalism functions often is that they have access, right? They have access to politicians, to official institutions and organizations, to researchers at universities, et cetera. And so I think one of the things that sort of journalists have to contend with is that they have access to the elite and the experts, but they don't really have access to those audiences in the same way anymore, whereas influencers do. And so, Ben, you were talking about the news finds me and sort of this attitude of like, well, it'll come to me. And clearly that's not really happening, right? But then journalists also sort of have this thing of like the work speaks for itself. You should come to my website and read my newsletter, my article. And I feel like there needs to be sort of this intermediary where like journalists, these big institutions that have the resources to do this should be sending their journalists out to talk to influencers. And to go on those podcasts that have millions and millions of unique viewers with like an audience that would happily listen to somebody talk about their deep expertise on this investigative project that they've been working on for a few years. But a lot of times I feel like journalists aren't like, well, why would I go on, Mr. Puppy Pants podcast or whatever, and it's like, well, maybe because that person has an audience of 5 million people who would be really interested and actually, you could inform them about things. And I think researchers as well, Jan and I have talked about this, is that, as a researcher, I'll get calls from media, right? And if it's the BBC or LA Times, it's like, yeah, sure, I'll make time. But realizing that like, if call her daddy called me and said, will you give me some background information on this? And I didn't know who that was, I would probably be like, no. Why? Even though that if I'm, as somebody doing research on climate change or vaccines or something like that, where this is actually an audience that you want to talk to. And so there's this sort of disconnect between sort of what journalism really wants to imagine itself to be versus what it actually is in the real world. And there's ways to connect that don't take necessarily billions of dollars of investment. It sort of takes everyone sort of rethinking the role of opinion leaders and trusted messengers, and who actually has the audience and what kind of information are we putting in front of them.
I wanted to say, because you said that humility is free. And so it really doesn't take millions of dollars to do this. You really just need to decide that you are in journalism to be in a position of service to the people that you are reporting for, to the people that you are talking to or talking with through the broadcast, through the Instagram feed, whatever, and just like come down a notch, I think is really important. And it's also so hard. You want to like protect the institution, but if the institution isn't serving the people, then blow up the institution. Let's start over, right? Maybe it's a little radical, but sometimes you just get so crazy about it, right? You just get so crazy because you're like, you can see, API is so interesting. We have a network of incredible local news organizations doing incredible things against all odds. And when I was telling Ben over dinner last night, like people will ask like, yo, Sam, you got like some access. Are you freaking out right now? And I get to say, I'm not. I actually feel so hopeful and so encouraged. Why? Because the news leaders that we get to work with at API, who are at the local level or even at the neighborhood level under local, they are beyond this. The cloud is silver for a lot of these people. It's not just a silver lining. And so that level of access and understanding of what is happening boots on the ground keeps you encouraged. It keeps you hopeful. It keeps you connected to the possibility of what can happen when news decides to truly serve the community that they're reporting for, not reporting at.
I am going to open this up on this excellent note. I'm going to open it up to see if anyone has any questions. I will not ask my question if Mr. Puppy Pants is a real news influencer who we all should be following. Oh, I don't know whose hand I saw first. Here, okay, here we go.
Hi, I have a comment and then a question. I think we talked a little bit about the difference between accessibility of local news and news from influencers and journalists. And I think part of it you touched on a little bit about how we monetize access to these different sources. Local news, I find it very difficult to get to my local news because of the paywalls behind some of these things. I don't have the money to have subscriptions to local news, national news, all sorts of different variety of news sources, where when you go to social media platforms and you're getting resources that are free, that's more accessible to people. And so I think it's really interesting to talk about how we might create more customizable ways to pay for our media, because we've talked about how important it is that the journalists are doing such detailed work that deserve to be paid for, but we need to be able to find ways to creatively monetize it, where we're seeing influencers are getting paid for their work and it's not coming out of the pockets of the people who are consuming it.
A recent report from Substack, actually, I think dropped last month. It was called The State of Create. Would highly recommend you guys check that out. It'll give you a lot of insights into creators and their fans, how much they're actually getting, how the algorithm is not just set up against local news organizations, but even within this influencer and creator economy, the algorithm is pumping out short form content, but fans want to pay for long form content that they almost never see in their feed. And then you add to that what's happening within a news organization, right? And so everybody is trying to eat. Even these influencers, they really, really are. They're trying to eat. And so how do you make that happen? And how can our tech catch up with that? I think like for local news, there's some really cool things happening with the launch of, dozens of nonprofits. I mean, they're spinning up quickly. They're getting some seed funding. They're able to take donations, right? That is helpful for folks who are in paywalled communities. These nonprofits typically come in as a non-paywalled news opportunity. I think that partnerships with creators, because here's the thing, is that like for a creator who is essentially aggregating a local news story in that they paid for it. Now I'm telling you what it is. It's hurting the business too, right? And so if you're gonna do that, because there are people who cannot, I'm not gonna tell y'all how many subscriptions I have, because this is live streamed and my husband might watch, right? So I'm not telling you, but we've all hit a subscription cap probably anyway, right? And so at least if there was a concerted and intentional partnership opportunity with news and local creators, then the creators themselves can also talk about, reporter so-and-so spent 4 weeks on this story and had to file this much information and weed through 200 pages of documents in order to get you this story, right? Because we just don't even know the time that it takes to do most of this. We think because the information feels free online that it is created as fast as we can consume it, and it's just not the case, right? And if you can just remind anyone of their freshman college English class and how long it took them to write a paper, they would know that it takes a minute to get some thoughts down, especially if you're gonna, diversify your sources and not just use official, but use community sources too. But I would love to see more of that. And we see some folks doing, monetizing the story page, for example, that you can pay just to read one story, or you can read one story and then donate. There are news organizations who are partnering with their local school district, with other large businesses like local, the electric company or whatever the case might be, so that the subscription is through the organization and then you have access. And so people are getting more creative, but I know it certainly doesn't feel fast enough.
Thank you all so much. I'm so bummed I came in late. I was at another event, and it sounds like you're from Palm Beach or live in Palm Beach.
I am.
Yeah, so shout out. Sorry, am I?
What? You know Palm Beach?
Delray Beach, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so sorry. My question, I've been sitting here reflecting, and my hobbies are more in sports and technology, and so I was thinking about this conversation about how I consume sports media, how I consume technology media, and I'm wondering what you all think about how people's news habits in general are shaped by the different on-ramps into it, because I have found myself, as I was sitting here reflecting, because I enjoy the sports journalism sort of debate talk show, when I'm watching CNN, I'm like, okay, get over the news, start arguing about, the politics, because, and then, on the technology side of things, I follow MKBHD, who's a big tech influencer, and I trust him, like you all said, follows all that, but there's not an equivalent, if MK says hey, this phone is really good, I'm gonna believe that. There's not the equivalent. So all that to say, how much do you all think about people's crossover news habits from sports or tech into politics and vice versa? Do people's news consumption of politics inform how they shape news or how they consume news in other spheres? And just what is that overlap? So much of what you all were saying was resonating, because I feel like every ex-NBA player has a podcast now. It's there's Club Shay Shay, and even the whole LeBron, Stephen A. Smith hubbub over the last couple of weeks was sort of legacy media versus new content creators, and then he goes on Pat McAfee's show, and so there's just so much parallel to sports. So I'm just curious how you all think about that, or is it the same? Those of you that study it, is it all the same news media, or is there different silos, and how can you help us that are not experts understand our news consumption as broadly speaking?
A little bit. And so the way people sort of get socialized to news and politics and those on-ramps can be very, very different. A lot of young men actually come to politics through sports, I mean, anyone who says that sports aren't political has never watched sports. But so a lot of them sort of become interested in sort of traditional sort of national politics through this lens of coming through sports. But I do think that people's information environments do socialize them also to how to be political. And so I think part of the problem is that a lot of young people are learning how to be political on social media, which is the worst way to be political. You know, like it's angry, it is contentious, it is you know, going for the hot takes and the snark above actual sort of commentary. So I think a lot of young people are sort of artificially put off politics because they sort of think that's what politics is, even though that's actually a very, very small subset of politics. So there's tensions there. There's also these, the way that young audiences especially, and sort of people who didn't kind of grow up in a traditional news environment, basically anybody born past 1995, is that there's this tension between authenticity and curation, right? They want everything to be authentic and real, but they want it intensely curated to their interests. But there's also this tension between sort of neutrality and truth that oftentimes, while you're sort of thinking about what's authentic and what has been curated to me and sort of what is the objective truth versus what feels like, sometimes it feels to a lot of these people that are really sort of into authenticity and they're sort of in this environment where authenticness and the performance of authenticity is really, really important, that neutrality to them feels very fake and really feels like, how could you talk about this and then not come down on a side, whether this is right or whether this is wrong. And so I think there's this sort of changing expectations about what journalism should do among young people. I think a lot of people get really frustrated when they see journalism not taking a side. To them, that feels inauthentic, that feels fake. And so I do think that the cultures in these digital information environments in which people are in are sort of shaping their perceptions of audiences, whether they're being scared out of it because it seems too contentious, or whether they sort of seem to think that, well, journalism has nothing to offer me because they're not even telling me what's real or not. They're just sort of reporting in the most bland, thin way that is very dissatisfying to somebody who's seeing all kinds of opinions and interpretations of it. And so I do think we have to think kind of really hard how these different information ecosystems are kind of socializing people to what is politics, what is political, and how do I behave in a political environment.
I think I would add to that, what are your expectations across those ecosystems? It's, you know, we talk a lot about channels, and if you are going to go to HBO, you know what your expectation is. And if you are going to go to, you know, HGTV, you know what you're going to get, right? And so when you go to your sportscast or to ESPN, you have a level of expectation. When you go to the local news source, should likely be a different level of expectation. And when we are more engaged in curating our own feeds, I think we can be more, we enable ourselves to really see the channels and then to set our expectations as we're entering into those spaces. And so it requires actively engaging in the life that you're living, which these algorithms really don't want us to do. They want us to be passive consumers and scroll and scroll and scroll. And so how do you shake yourself out of that when you're listening to sportscasts, you know, or The Pivot or whatever? You know, I love all of these, you know, they're all down in Miami, right? So love them. I think they're great, right? And I have a very high expectation for what I want from them. And I have a different expectation for other types of news in the online spaces, whether it's coming from a newsletter or a TikTok or whatever the case might be. So I think we need like our own interrogation of self when we do this work. I think that so often when I talk to news leaders, and even when I was in the newsroom myself, I thought, gosh, we are so equipped with the skills that we need to really connect and to report and to transform. And so often we do that when we're reporting, but then when it comes to self-interrogation, when it comes to self-awareness, and when it comes to curiosity and, you know, questioning internal authority, sometimes we don't do that, right? And so how can we be, I think, journalists for ourselves too is a good way of thinking about it.
Time for one more question.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm sure you've touched on this briefly a while ago, but could you give us a more of a little sense of the role of other local institutions in driving up community journalism? So local churches, local schools, and even local civil society organizations.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing this all over the place. I can't remember who I was talking to about the Pluralism Summit, and I was so encouraged by the bright spots that are happening across community and how we're bridging across difference. And it's happening in local libraries, it's happening in local news organizations and community foundations and schools. The partnerships are really wonderful because they're typically trade-based partnerships, not necessarily financial partnerships, which means they can build capacity without cost. And so we're seeing a lot of really cool things. I mean, we're seeing local reporting becoming school curriculum, for example. We're seeing a rise in social clubs at the local level, which people need to connect and feel a sense of membership. So we're seeing a lot of things. We're seeing documenter style programs, right, which takes this idea of citizen journalism and instead says, you be the ears, and let me train you on going to city council meetings and documenting and being an engaging. This is a part of your this is part of your civic duty that you can do this. And it's not just happening with adults in communities like Chicago. There are documenter style programs that are happening to re-engage the youth. Through their high school programs, right? And so we're seeing a lot of those really cool things that I think, I hope will catalyze civic engagement and contribute to civic health. We think that local news organizations ought to act as conveners of their community. And because local businesses and local nonprofits really have a stake in that too, it would be interesting for the news organization to kind of serve as the pillar and really help to hold that space. But for most folks, it means it's a different level. It's different skill set. You know, how do you navigate conflict in real time? How do you design for belonging if you were going to bring people together? How do you set community guidelines when they do show up so everybody knows how to show up? You know, those sorts of things. And then you add to that digital storytelling, right? So on the community engagement side, maybe they don't have a comms department and they're looking for the local newsroom to do that for you. And so there's a lot of interesting potential and really cool experiments kind of happening across the country. There are third spaces that are popping up, newsrooms owning coffee shops, newsrooms using, kind of retrofitting single screen movie theaters for community convening space, especially with immigrant populations, to reconnect them to home. So there's an opportunity too, I think, for local news and cultural institutions in their communities to combine forces, which also then increases trust, right? That there's this kind of proxy idea that the community organization that I trust the most with like my everything, because, they trust the newsroom. Right? And this partnership might be able to convey a greater sense of trust and opportunity for community after the fact.
Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you so much for the people here. Like, time is an incredibly precious resource, so I'm very grateful that everyone has given some of their time today. I'm going to turn it over to Landon, who has some additional announcements. Oh, and huge thank you to Landon and Ruth and Seth, who also helped get some of the undergraduate student comments that we presented earlier.
And thank you to Yana Krupnikov for organizing this session. So thank you, Yana. Okay, so this wraps up the first day of Democracy's Information Dilemma, but there is a special event tied to it. It is at Weil Hall, where the Ford School of Public Policy is. At 4 p.m., Kara Swisher, the journalist, is going to be interviewing Jeff Lawson, the owner of The Onion and a UM alum. There was registration beforehand, but we're a small crew. If you can go, you're probably going to get in. I can't guarantee it, but the closest thing to guaranteeing it, I can. And so there will be a wait list area. Feel free to head that way. We're going to head that way to listen to that great interview. It will also be live streamed. And we look forward to continuing the conference tomorrow at 9 a.m. At the Ross Business School complex in Blau Hall on Blau Colloquium on the 5th floor. So thank you all for coming today. Look forward to seeing you again tomorrow, and go blue.